Welcome to Windows 95 Traincast, the program designed to prepare you for the move to and implementation of Microsoft's Windows 95. Windows 95 Traincast is sponsored in part by Dell Computer Corporation. Be watching today to find out how you can win a full multimedia Dell computer system simply by viewing our program. Our host for today's show is well known in the computer training profession. Elliot Mazie is president of the Mazie Center. He has authored 12 books, including the popular Computer Training Handbook by Lakewood Publications. Now live from the Microsoft campus in Redmond, Washington, Elliot Mazie.
Hello. I would like to welcome you to the fourth show in the Windows 95 Traincast series, focusing on preparing IS professionals for Windows 95, the next major release of the standard operating system for the desktop and portable PC. In our first two shows, we've shown why migrating to Windows 95 is a pragmatic business decision. Our last show shifted to preparing IS professionals for migration. We covered a step-by-step installation and rollout plan. Today's show has been anxiously awaited, covering a subject that is generally in the forefront of an IS professional's mind: networking. Windows 95 is an integrated and complete operating system. As a trainer, I find Windows 95 has some very compelling features. It provides a more intuitive way to work, an exciting new user interface, and an on-ramp to the information superhighway. But let's be honest, a feature-rich operating system is only as good as its networkability. I know from my experience in the training industry, connecting to a network can often be tricky for users and cause support headaches. The basic task of connecting a PC to a server and then to other PCs is still a challenge. Windows 95 has been designed with the explicit goal of easy connectivity to a network. Before we get started, let's briefly review all the information-rich tools available in addition to this broadcast. As a training professional, I am impressed with the sheer number of resources Microsoft is providing to help us all become thoroughly educated and prepared for the release of Windows 95. I suggest you grab a pen and write these down. The details of where and how you can get them will be shown later in the show. If you have already seen this list, let this serve as a reminder to take action. It is critical for the IS professional to become totally familiar with this new technology and to provide leadership to the business organizations and end users as they move to the next era of computing. This series of Traincast broadcasts, along with the other resources, will help you know the product inside and out. The Windows 95 Reviewer Guide details information about the Windows 95 features and functionality. Win News, an electronic newsletter that details the current status of Windows 95 and provides information about upcoming events as Windows 95 nears completion. The Gartner Group report is a study on the cost of migrating to Windows 95 and the eventual savings to your organization. The Windows 95 Resource Kit is an exciting, exclusive Microsoft collection providing complete technical information and tools to help IS professionals and Windows enthusiasts become experts on Windows 95. This Microsoft project template gives you a head start in setting up your deployment plans for Windows 95. The template consists of a starter schedule of typical deployment tasks and specially formatted views tailored for the Windows 95 deployment effort. Inside Windows 95 is a first book by Adrian King, and it fully documents the architecture of the next generation of Windows. The Traincast series and other Microsoft TV broadcasts, as you know, offer accessible, up-to-the-minute information on many Microsoft products. Microsoft Authorized Technical Education Centers provide certified training courses on Windows 95, and many of these education centers are hosting today's show. Finally, the Mazie Center offers two products to further your education. By subscribing to Windows 95 at Mazie.com on the internet, you will receive ongoing information, resources, and tips on a variety of Windows 95 training and learning strategies. The Managing Windows 95 Learning Kit is a briefing in the box to keep corporate end users and management up to date on learning events surrounding Windows 95. Today's show is scheduled to run for 4 hours. At the 2-hour point in our program, we'll take a 10-minute brain break. We are happy to have Autumn Womack as our presenter today. Autumn started at Microsoft as a technical support engineer for MS-DOS, Windows, and Windows for Workgroup. Autumn is now the worldwide training technical lead for the Windows 95 project. Her team develops the technical course materials used by product support services and other technical support groups. Autumn will talk about Windows 95 networking. She'll demonstrate how to configure workstations and servers to communicate with other Microsoft networking operating systems and offer troubleshooting tips to resolve connectivity issues. The show is divided into 4 main sections. Following each section, we will take a few minutes to answer live questions. Microsoft has a team of Windows 95 engineers standing by right now to answer your questions, so feel free to call anytime during the show. Here's a number, 206-635-7066, and some of your questions will be selected to be answered live on the air. Now, one more thing before Autumn gets started. We are continuing our computer giveaway contest through the end of our Traincast series. Now, listen up. This is your chance to win a complete multimedia computer system provided by the Dell Corporation. It is so easy to win. Here is what you do. I'm going to ask you a simple question pertaining to the content of this show. I promise it's not a trick question. 100 names will be drawn from the correct answers to today's question. Winners will receive a free copy of Microsoft Encarta. Now, everyone that calls will have their name entered into a grand prize drawing for a chance to win the Dell Multimedia Computer System. The winner of this system will be announced at the end of our last show on August 8th. So mark it on your calendar. You must be watching in order to win. Now, I'm probably not supposed to do this, but let me give you a little hint about today's contest question. If I were you, I'd pay particular attention to the networking protocols supported in Microsoft Windows 95. There are several, but remember at least one of them is, well, I'm probably not supposed to say it, but I'll get back to it later. Now let's get started. I think we're all anxious to find out about the new 32-bit protected mode networking infrastructure and how new features facilitate integrating the desktop into a heterogeneous network environment. Autumn?
Elliot. Connecting to network resources is easy with Windows 95. I'll demonstrate how you can be more productive by accessing resources more quickly with the new user interface. Configuring the network environment is also easy with Windows 95. I'll go through detailed demonstrations on how to configure your PC as a client to other Microsoft network machines, such as Windows NT, Windows for Workgroups, and of course other PCs running Windows 95. During this program, I will focus on 4 main areas of Microsoft Windows 95 and Microsoft networking. In the first section, we'll go through the architectural overview and browsing the network resources. In the second section, we'll talk about configuring the Microsoft Network client. The following section will configure the Microsoft Network server, and in the final section, I'll also demonstrate network printing using Microsoft Point and Print servers. Throughout my presentation, I'll be recommending troubleshooting tips. Well, let's go ahead and get started. The 2 desktops in front of me are Dell Optiplex 590 Pentiums with 8 megabytes of RAM each. They're currently running Windows 95. And the laptop in front of me is a Dell Latitude XP with 8 megabytes of RAM, also running Windows 95. It also has 2 PCM-CIA sockets. The 2 machines on my right are also Dell Optiplex 590s. The first machine is running Windows for Workgroups 3.1.1. It also has 8 megabytes of RAM on that Dell Optiplex. The machine in the back is a Windows NT 3.5 server, and it has 32 megabytes of RAM running on that Dell Optiplex 590. In Windows 95, the easiest way to access network resources is to open the network neighborhood. I'm going to demonstrate for you on my main PC how to do this. You'll notice the icon I have highlighted is the network neighborhood icon. That appears automatically on your desktop when you have the network installed. This is how we browse resources in the workgroup. There are 2 benefits of using the network neighborhood. You'll notice that the PCs that appear are only the ones in my workgroup. This reduces network traffic when we're browsing the network neighborhood only, as opposed to browsing the entire network. Another benefit of using the network neighborhood is it's also less overwhelming. For a typical user, they'll probably be accessing remote resources from a machine in their work group. So this is less overwhelming than if I saw a whole bunch of servers from the entire network that I probably would not be using on a day-to-day basis. If I wanted to access resources for any of these servers, all I need to do is just double-click, and as you see, these are the resources for the NT server. The NT server happens to have 3 printers shared, as well as 2 directories shared. And I can just close that down when I'm done looking at those resources. If I wanted to view the entire network, I can just click on the entire network, and it would browse my entire network neighborhood, which would include multiple domains and work groups. In this particular example, all we see is the Traincast work group, or the Traincast domain, because we're running an NT server. As we see in the entire network view, here is the domain Traincast, which is what all these machines are part of, the Traincast domain. If there were other domains or work groups in my network environment, these would be listed as well in the entire network view. Windows 95 uses a similar browsing algorithm as Windows NT. Browse masters and backup browsers may take several minutes to sync up their server lists so they are current. So when you browse the network for resources, the list of servers come from the available browse master and backup browsers. So if no browser is available to respond to the browse request, you may not see any servers in the list. This would explain when the network neighborhood would be empty and not have any servers listed in the network neighborhood. However, even though the browse list may be empty, you still would be able to access the machine directly by typing in the exact name of the server and the share name. And we'll go into more details about how to do that. When troubleshooting specific servers that don't appear in the browse list, it is important to realize 2 things. Once a server logs on to the network, it may take up to 15 minutes before the servers are added to the browse list and appear in the network neighborhood. If a server shuts down, it may take up to 45 minutes before the server is removed from the browse list. If you want to browse for resources on a server, there's a few different ways to do this. Probably for power users, they would go to the Start button, select Run, and if they know the name of the server and SharePoint they want to connect to, they could type it in. As you see here, I've already got typed in my 2 backslashes followed by wfw_pc, which is my Windows for Workgroups server, and the MS Office directory is shared on that server. And you'll see as soon as I click OK, I have all the resources available to me from that MS Office directory. If I didn't happen to know the exact name of that server, I can select Find from the Start button, and I can find Computer. In this case, I can just type in WFW. I don't need any wildcards or any backslashes or anything. And it should find the WFW_PC. This is useful in this particular example if I didn't know the name was WFW-PC or _PC or just WFW_PC. Again, it found the machine, and I can double-click on it, and again, I can see all the shares from that PC. And you'll notice I have not only directories shared, but I also have printers shared. Once the server is accessed, of course, it's as easy as just clicking on that icon and getting all its resources. And if you want to view a list of all your resources, you should try the Explorer view. I've got a shortcut to Explorer right here. We'll talk about shortcuts in more detail in a little while. But you can also get Explorer from the Start button, selecting Programs, and coming down to Windows Explorer. The Explorer view is similar to File Manager from Windows for Workgroups and Windows NT, but what's neat about Explorer is it gives you the view of all of your drives on your machine, basically. So we start with My Computer, You'll notice that we have floppy drive A as well as the C drive, and I happen to have a CD-ROM on this machine, so it also shows D, but I don't have any CDs in there. And you'll notice the network neighborhood is available. So I can see all of my resources in the Explorer. I can use the toolbar to connect to a network drive, and you'll notice the little entry that says Map Network Drive could tell you what each of these tool buttons mean. I click on that toolbar button. You'll notice Map Network Drive E is the next available drive letter, and I can type in, let's say, the Win95 PC, and what do I have shared on this machine? Let's see. This is my Win95 PC, and it shows me that the C drive is shared, so I'll just type in C. It's checking for the machine, and in fact, here it is in my Explorer view. You'll notice the syntax shows C on Win95 PC. So the share name comes first, and then it's followed by the server name. And you'll notice the E drive is also designated here, which means that the E drive is mapped to this resource. If you didn't want to use the toolbar and you prefer to use the menu, you can also select from Tools, Map Network Drive, and we would get the same dialog box. Windows 95 Explorer gives me a more complete look at my resources than the Windows File Manager does, because as you can see, all my resources are in one window. Also notice the long file names that are available in Windows Explorer, because Windows 95's Explorer is a 32-bit application. Let's compare the Windows 95 Explorer to the Windows File Manager. You'll notice File Manager allows me to view just one drive at a time. Currently, I have the C drive in view, and here are all my directories, and of course here are all my files for the current directory highlighted. If I wanted to take a look at another drive, for example my D drive, which happens to be connected to my main PC with a scenes directory shared, I can look at my D drive. And if I want to look at E, I'd have to click on the E icon and take a look at E. You'll see it's not as intuitive and not as easy to use. I guess if I wanted to view everything at once, I'd have to go to Window, and then I can tile horizontally or tile vertically, but that's basically what we've got in Windows File Manager. Again, Windows 95 Explorer is a lot easier to use. You'll notice we have smaller icons that represent each object, so there's a lot of enhancements that have been made in Windows 95. Let's get back to Windows 95. From the Explorer view, I'd like to show you how easy it is to connect to various network resources. Again, I can use my toolbar button, and I can actually go down my most recently used connections. And if I want to connect to my WFW PC, let's say the MS Office directory, all I need to do is select it, click OK, and here is MS Office on the WFW PC mapped to the E drive. Let me try to connect to my other Windows 95 machine. Let's see, Win95. Well, let's connect to the C drive. Click OK. You'll notice I also have this resource, C, on Win95 available to me, all within the same view. One more time, I'll connect to the NT server. I'll go from the menu this time, from Tools, Map Network Drive. G happens to be my next available drive letter. Of course, I can select any drive letter I choose if I'm running an application that is expecting to see a particular drive letter. And I'll type in the NT server name. And let's share, I believe the MS Apps directory is shared on that server. And now we're connected to the MS Apps directory on the NT server, and you'll notice it's mapped to drive G. Another way to keep track of your network resources is to actually have shortcuts for them on the desktop. There's a couple of ways to do that. I can actually highlight, for example, this resource, MS Apps, on the NT server. With my secondary mouse button, drag it onto the desktop, And when I let go, I have the option to create a shortcut, and I say yes. And you'll notice this resource is now on the desktop as shortcut to the MS apps on the NT server. If I wanted to create another shortcut for a resource that was not mapped to a drive letter, I can go into the network neighborhood. Let's say select something else from the NT server like the net login directory, highlight that directory with my secondary mouse button, and drag it onto the desktop, create the shortcut. And now I have a folder shortcut to the net logon directory on the NT server. You'll notice the difference is I did not require to map a drive letter to this resource, which is a good thing if you don't want to use up a lot of drive letters and you don't have any applications that require having a drive letter mapped. So you have both options. Any of these servers or resources can be placed on the desktop as a shortcut or link. Shortcuts are static objects. They stay on your desktop all the time, whether or not you're currently connected to the network. Shortcuts are a convenient way to maintain pointers to commonly used network resources like folders, printers, or documents. Simply by double-clicking on a shortcut, I can get at the information or resource that I need. Here I have my shortcut to MS Apps on the NT server highlighted. All I need to do is double-click on it. As you can see, it's easy as viewing all the subdirectories from that shared resource. Objects, such as these shortcuts, can be renamed. For example, all I need to do is highlight it, secondary mouse click, select rename, cool shortcut for the demo, if that's what I wanted to call it. And again, obviously it accepts long file names. Any names on the desktop are long file name aware. You'll notice that I have different objects. One is called a server object, and one is a mapped resource object. If I wanted to just have a shortcut to a server, I can highlight the server name, create the shortcut on the desktop, and when I select my secondary mouse click context menu, and if you recall that this is referred to as a context menu, the map network drive is actually grayed out. Okay, well, the reason the map network drive is grayed out is because this is for a server. We wouldn't map a drive letter to a server. We would need the actual resource, such as a shared directory. For example, let's say the M8 directory is shared. I can highlight that and create a shortcut for that M8 directory on my desktop. And now, when I secondary mouse click, you'll notice the map network drive is available. So if I did want to map a drive letter to this resource, you'll notice that the path to the resource is already in place and the next available drive letter comes up. Again, we can select any drive letter we need. We'll just default to H. And of course, we see the reconnect at logon. So if I wanted to have this resource reconnected every time I log on to Windows 95, I can do that here. Shortcuts are a great way to customize the desktop for your work style and are more intuitive for you to use. By now, you've all probably heard about plug and play. Windows 95 will automatically configure your plug and play network adapter, so no more setting jumpers or worrying about conflicting IRQs with other adapters in your PC. Not only does plug and play make configuring your PC easy, it makes accessing network resources dynamic when you have a PCM-CIA network adapter, such as this, or a docking station for your laptop. What I'm going to do now is demonstrate the dynamic plug-and-play feature with viewing resources in the network neighborhood. I'm going to click on the network neighborhood, and you'll notice that there will not be any servers shown in the network neighborhood. It's currently looking for them, and you'll notice Windows 95 have these neat animated icon cursors which tell the user that we're not locked up because the animated cursor is moving. And we are searching the network neighborhood for servers, but because we're not connected to the network, we shouldn't find any. By default, it'll bring us the entire network icon of the globe. But again, you'll notice that we have no servers listed from our current work group. What I'd like to do is insert the PCM-CIA adapter. This is a Zircom credit card Ethernet adapter. And I'll insert it into the PCM-CIA slot. I don't know if you heard that beep, but typically the PCM-CIA devices will give you a double beep to let you know they've been inserted correctly. You also should take note that beside the battery signal to let us know that we're plugged in or not, and it tells us how many hours remaining, there's also a PCM-CIA icon on our taskbar to give us some status information about the PC card, which I'll talk about more in a few minutes. Let me go ahead and double-click on the network neighborhood again. And now you know dynamically we're able to see our servers. We have our main PC, which is this machine here, the NT server, which is behind me, as well as the WFW PC, and the Win95 PC is this machine right here. So with plug and play in Windows 95, you can dynamically connect to your network resources. Windows 95 also provides some great safety mechanisms for loading and unloading drivers for your PCM-CIA devices. Let me point out the PCM-CIA icon on the taskbar again. And if I right-click, it tells me what the name of the PCM-CIA card is, and it also lets me stop the card. When I highlight this taskbar and I click to stop the PCM-CIA card, what's happening now is we're dynamically unloading the protected mode PCM-CIA device drivers. I will soon get a message to tell me that it's okay to physically remove the card from the laptop because all the device drivers would have been unloaded. Here's the message that tells us we may safely remove the device. I click OK, and now it's safe to remove the device. The 32-bit protected mode Windows 95 network architecture can be divided into 4 layers. The first layer are the network providers. Microsoft ships protected mode network providers connecting to Microsoft networks as well as Novell NetWare networks. We'll talk in more detail about the Novell NetWare network environment in our next program. The second layer are the redirectors. These are our installable file systems that are managed by a component called IFS Manager, which is our installable file system manager. The third layer are the protocols. These are our transports, such as IPX and NetBEUI. And our fourth layer are the adapters, the actual drivers that drive the net cards in the PC. Network providers provide a consistent user interface for several things. One, for the net login. When a user actually logs into Windows, the login will be the same regardless of what network operating system they're running. Password authentication is also managed by network providers. And when we're browsing for resources in the network neighborhood, you'll notice that all the servers have the same icon. So we don't distract the user with a different icon for different network operating systems. Typically, users don't care which network operating system they're connecting to, they just want to access their resources. Another important thing the network providers do for us is when adding or removing connections to or from a server, the user can enter any kind of server name string that they're comfortable with, and it will be resolved by the correct network provider. For example, let me go ahead and map a network drive to a particular network resource. I'll demonstrate 3 different types of server name strings. We have something referred to as the UNC, or Universal Naming Convention. This is where we begin with a double backslash. We have a server name, and then followed by a directory name that we're sharing on the network. That is referred to as UNC, and that is the standard default in Windows 95 and Microsoft networks. For Novell NetWare users, you may recall that you start with a server name, then followed by a // and then a volume name, which is typically sys, followed by a colon, and then followed by the directory name. And something completely different is what Banyan Vines uses. They start with a directory name, followed by an @ sign, and then a group name, followed by another @ sign, and then the organization name. In Windows 95, the user does not have to be concerned with what the correct name string will be, because it'll be resolved by the protected mode network provider. Let's move on to redirectors. Redirectors are responsible for the file I/O. This is what makes requests to open a file, close a file, or write to a file. A great thing about the redirector is it abstracts from the local file system. For example, Windows 95 is running on a FAT file system. The Windows NT server could be running on an NTFS or an HPFS file system. But when I'm opening a file on that Windows NT server, I don't have to worry about if I'm running on NTFS or HPFS or FAT. The redirector abstracts all of that local file system information, and as long as both redirector and server are speaking the same language, we're doing okay. The language I'm referring to is something called SMB, Server Message Block. This is the language that Microsoft nets use, SMB, for our redirectors and servers. Novell NetWare uses a different language called NCP. NCP is the NetWare Core Protocol language. In Windows 95, we ship protected mode and real mode SMB and NCP redirectors. The other great thing in Windows 95 is that with both of these protected mode redirectors, they can both use the protected mode cache called vcache. And this is where we do client-side and server-side caching for both of these redirectors. Let's move on to the protocols. The protocols literally are rules to communicate. This is how we transport data between two machines. Protocols also provide services such as segmenting the data so it's manageable by the media or the network card. So for example, if I have a 10 megabyte file that I want to transfer between two machines, it's the protocol's responsibility to segment that 10 megabyte file so that it is manageable by the net card that is expecting to see something like 4K if you're running Token Ring, or 1500 bytes if you're running Ethernet. Windows 95 protocols are based on the NDIS 3.1 and 2.0 specifications. NDIS is our netcard driver interface spec. And in Windows 95, the protocols that we support are TCP/IP in protected mode, IPX/SPX in both protected mode and real mode, and the NetBEUI protocol, both in protected mode and real mode. Let's move into the netcard adapter, and I'll go into more details about configuring those protocols later in the program. The netcard adapter drivers change the bytes received from the protocol to bits to be encoded for a specific media type, such as Token Ring or Ethernet or ArcNet, which are all supported in Windows 95. NDIS 3.1 gives you the protected mode support and can be dynamically loaded and unloaded, provided the card is already initialized in the PC. The second type of netcard driver we will support is a Windows NT mini-port driver that is an NDIS 3.0 compliant. Something to keep in mind about NDIS 3.0 is that the NDIS 3.0 drivers that shipped in Windows for Workgroups 3.1.1 are not going to be supported in Windows 95. All those drivers have been upgraded to NDIS 3.1 and ship in Windows 95. The exception to the NDIS 3.0 support is with the Windows NT mini-port drivers. The third type of netcard adapter driver we support is an NDIS 2.0 MAC driver, or Media Access Control driver. The cool thing about NDIS 2.0 is that even though it's real mode, we can let that driver bind with an NDIS 3.1 protected mode protocol, such as the TCP/IP, IPX, or NetBEUI protected mode protocols. So you can have a real mode netcard driver talking to a protected mode protocol. The fourth type of driver we support is the ODI MLID. The ODI MLIDs are native in the Novell NetWare environment, and again, even though they're real mode drivers, Windows 95 will provide support to have that real mode netcard ODI driver to bind with protected mode protocol drivers. Let's get back to how plug and play is implemented in this network architecture. When an event takes place, such as inserting the PCM-CIA netcard adapter or docking a laptop, the driver for the netcard adapter is loaded into memory dynamically. This is part of the NDIS 3.1 specification. Then the other components in the network stack, such as the protocols and the redirectors and the network providers, are all notified of the event. When the network provider is notified, it refreshes the network neighborhood, and that is why we were dynamically able to see the list of servers in the network neighborhood when we inserted the PCM-CIA adapter into the laptop. So now you know Windows 95 provides great 32-bit protected mode networking, but what about real mode networking support? Well, why would you need real mode networking support? Well, the primary reason would be is if you're running a server-based installation of Windows 95. You may recall from the Windows 3X days, the server-based installation is when you typed in the setup/A, setup/N type of scenario. Well, in Windows 95, we make that much easier for users by using a net setup exe file, which we'll talk about in more detail in the system management program down the road. But let's get back to why you need real mode network support. Well, if you're doing a server-based installation of Windows 95, your workstation has to have at least enough files to get the real mode network running so that it can connect to the server that's running the Windows 95 system files, because you're trying to access Windows and you don't have Windows loaded just yet. So you need a real mode net to get this workstation talking to the server so that you can launch Windows 95. The great thing in Windows 95 is when you do launch Windows, the real mode drivers from the network operating system are now replaced with protected mode drivers using the server-based transition. Transition is a technical term we use that says we can unload real mode drivers and replace them with protected mode drivers. And why do we want to unload real mode drivers? To give us more conventional memory to run our games. Anyway, Windows 95 does not support transition with TCP/IP or DLC. The only real mode protocols we will support is IPX and NetBEUI. Let's talk a little bit more detail about real mode networking support in Windows 95. Basically, everything you need is in a file called net.exe. Net.exe is similar to Windows for Workgroups in that it includes your real mode SMB redirector and the NetBEUI protocol. In addition, Windows 95 has added an NW reader, in other words, a redirector that speaks the NCP language to talk to NetWare, as well as NW Link, which is the IPX SPX protocol. All of these are real mode components provided by Microsoft, and there would be no need to have Novell's components in real mode. Again, we will unload these real mode components during a server-based setup and load the protected ones after that. One thing to point out is in Windows 95, we no longer have the real mode server as part of net.exe. In other words, you can't do a net start server as you could with the workgroup add-on from MS-DOS. So if you wanted to continue using a real mode server, you need to continue using the workgroup add-on from MS-DOS product. Now that we've talked a little bit about the architecture, let's discuss the configuration files. Windows 95 uses the registry database for all system and user settings. The registry replaces the INI files such as WinINI and SystemINI. Windows 95 will continue using the WinINI and SystemINI for backwards compatibility, but the registry is where we store most of the system settings and user settings. And we want to get third-party vendors used to writing to the registry, just as it's used in Windows NT. Well, when we're talking about configuration files for networking, and we're talking specifically about the NDIS components, remember NDIS was our specification for the network drivers, we use a file called protocol ini. Protocol ini information for the protected mode settings are merged into the registry. The real mode settings, however, remain in the protocol ini file. One thing to note is that when you're running the real mode network in Windows 95, even though we keep the protocol ini file, we still do require the registry because that has interesting information such as the computer name and workgroup name. Let's take a look at the registry just so you get an idea of where these network settings are located. I actually have a shortcut to the regedit file. Regedit is a file that Windows 95 ships to help you view the registry settings. It also has a neat find feature so you can find or search for keys, values, or data. What I'm going to do is go directly to the data and the values for the networking components. From the HKey local machine hive, we'll go down to System, Current Control Set, Services. Let's take a look at Class, and you'll notice we have a whole bunch of different classes of devices here, including for net. This is where our net card adapter information is. For example, this driver description is the Intel Ether Express 16 net card. It tells us the INF file that's being used to get information about this card, as well as other settings of the card, such as the I/O address and the IRQ. And the transceiver is an important setting as well to take note of. We also have information here about our client. In this particular example, I have the client for Microsoft Networks installed. And the net service would be our server. And here we have the file and printing sharing for Microsoft. That is basically our server. When we're talking about ODI networks, in other words, an ODI net card driver, that driver looks at a file called net.cfg. Net.cfg is what's used typically in Novell NetWare environments. Because the ODI drivers are real mode, there's no reason to merge any of those entries into the registry. So all the real mode settings are kept in the net.cfg file. That concludes this segment on browsing, the network, and architectural overview. Let's get back to Elliot and take some of your calls. And after we answer some of your questions, I'll step you through how to configure your PC to access other Windows 95 machines, Windows NT machines, Windows for Workgroups machines, and the Internet.
Thank you, Autumn. We appreciate all the valuable information. I have a question for you, but first I want to remind our viewers to call for their chance to win, yes, a Dell computer or Microsoft Encarta. Just answer this simple question. Name one of the network protocols supported by Windows 95. Here it is again. Name just one of the network protocols supported by Windows 95. If you know the answer to this question, call us right now. Call toll-free at 1-800-254-4069. I can assure you your chances of winning are much better than winning the lottery. Autumn, I see that there are multiple ways to connect to network resources and to map network drives. Are there any technical reasons one method would be preferable to another?
Well, that's a good question, Elliot. Let me go ahead and demonstrate something for you on the PC here. What you're referring to is mapping a network resource to a drive letter. So for example, if I secondary mouse click a resource I have on the computer, you'll notice if I select Map Network Drive, the next available drive letter comes up on the screen. Well, right now, I do not have any drive letters mapped at all to any network resources. But I can see this resource just fine all day long. So if the resource is on the desktop, we don't need to map a drive letter. Also, if I'm exploring the desktop, I can also access that resource without needing to map a drive letter. If I use one of the native applications, such as, let's say, Notepad to Windows 95, and I want to open a file on that network resource, I can also view it without having to map that drive letter. However, there are some situations where you will need to map the drive letter, such as using an application that's not native to Windows 95, such as WinWord, for example. So we open up Microsoft Word, and if I do a file open, you'll notice under the drives, I just have my floppy A drive, which of course there's no floppy in there. and I'll have my C drive and my D drive where my CD-ROM is. But there are no network drives listed. Well, this is where I would have to map a drive. So I can map the next available drive letter E to my Win95 PC on the C drive. And now my E drive is mapped to this network resource. Now when I go into Microsoft Word, I can open, and now the E drive is available and I can find files from here. So yes, technically you would have to map a drive to a network resource if you're using an external application, but if you're using this resource on the desktop or from Explorer or from Notepad, for example, you would not have to map the network drive. That should answer the question, Elliot.
Thank you very much, Autumn. Now let's take some time to answer your questions. Autumn, why don't you come on over and we'll take some of our viewers' questions. Our Windows 95 engineers have been very busy. Remember, they're available throughout the show. Just call 206-635-7066. Joining Autumn and I is Frank Ramirez, Product Manager for Windows 95. Welcome, Frank.
Hi, Elliot.
One of the exciting things about live TV is we get live questions from there, and we had a call from John, who's a solution provider in Fairbanks. John expressed a real interest in Microsoft Exchange. Can you tell John a little bit about what Exchange is?
Sure. John, well, I've had the benefit of actually being on Exchange for quite a while, which you probably have not, but the thing about Microsoft Exchange is what we like to think about it internally is as a universal inbox. So with Exchange, you could receive, let's say, your faxes or your email all in the same place, and it would essentially look the same to you from the point of view of an end user. I think one of the most exciting things also about Exchange is the fact that we're working with third-party vendors at the present time to develop MAPI applications so that at some point in time in the future, you'll actually be able to receive voicemail on your Exchange.
So it just becomes sort of a unified place to kind of do
exactly.
communications in your business. That's real exciting. Autumn, we have a call from Jerry from San Rafael, and Jerry wants to know what kind of network adapter drivers can he use with Windows 95?
Well, Jerry can probably use a bunch of different kinds of network adapters that conform to different specifications. Windows 95 will support NDIS 2 network drivers, which are typically real mode, NDIS 3.1, of course, which is protected mode right out of the box. We will also support ODI, real mode network drivers, as well as NDIS 3.0 mini port drivers from Windows NT.
Yeah. Now trying to track all this stuff, I'm sure, where can the viewers get all this information?
Okay, well, the resource kit is a great place for practically all the questions anyone could have as a system administrator, and the online help in Windows 95 is awesome as well. Just one thing to keep in mind is Windows 95 does ship out of the box NDIS 3.1 drivers and NDIS 2.0 drivers. The Windows NT mini port drivers would have to come from Windows NT installation.
Excellent. Back to you, Frank. We had a call from Mike from Lake Placid, New York. Mike wanted to know, in terms of Microsoft Network, will they be able to receive email over the network?
Actually, you will be able to receive email over the network. Microsoft Network will be an icon essentially on your desktop, and all you'll have to do is double-click to access Microsoft Network. What we've done at Microsoft is we actually set up a network around the country in about 80 cities so that when you double-click and you actually tap into Microsoft Network, you'll be making actually a local telephone call, so it won't be a long-distance call at all.
That's real exciting, and that's probably going to be an international product if I know Microsoft. There'll be places all around the world. Carl in Las Vegas, and I assume this is not a gambling question, but wants to know, will my network applications have to be rewritten to work with Windows 95 new network providers? Oh,
no, not at all. As a matter of fact, network applications are typically written to the WinNet 32 or WinNet 16 API interface. So as long as they're consistent writing to that interface, they should be able to work with Windows 95, Windows for Workgroups, or Windows NT.
We also for you, Autumn, Barbara, who runs a help desk in San Fernando, wanted to know what kind of redirectors are supported by Windows 95.
Okay, out of the box, without any extra components needing to be installed, right out of the box in Windows 95, we have real mode and protected mode redirectors to connect to Microsoft networks, which include Windows Workgroups, Windows NT, and also right out of the box we have real mode and protected mode redirectors to speak to Novell NetWare servers. Windows 95 also provides support for various other third-party redirectors, and as a matter of fact, we have we have the files necessary so that you can install through the familiar UI.
I see.
So you don't have to go through a third-party setup program necessarily. And we'll support third-party redirectors such as from Banyan Vines, Deck Pathworks, Artisoft Lantastic, Sun's PCNFS, for example.
We have a question for you, and this comes from Lynette in New York City. I call this, when I saw it coming over our network here, I said this is my Mr. Rogers question.
Okay.
Want to know, they hear the word network, the network neighborhood.
Sure.
What is it, a friendly neighborhood?
Yeah, I think it's a really friendly neighborhood. Actually, when I moved from Windows Workgroups into Windows 95, one of the best benefits I saw was in terms of the graphical user interface over in the network neighborhood. Essentially, the network neighborhood is, the purpose of the network neighborhood is to make access to the resources over the network very easy, very seamless for the end user. So when you double click on the network neighborhood, you are what's put in front of you is essentially the resources or the servers that are in your immediate work group. And then you can also single click and then browse the entire network at that point in time. But then one of the coolest features, actually the thing that I thought was really, really neat in terms of the network neighborhood, was the fact that we can take shortcuts to, let's say, remote server locations and drop them right in the network neighborhood. So you can actually customize the network neighborhood so that you have easy access to the resources you use most often.
And I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, that's a great feature.
It seems to me that we're dealing with a very visual approach to looking at the network. Is that the case?
Exactly, and as Frank was saying, it's seamless, so you don't have to worry about where is this resource coming from, is it coming from some third-party network, or it just reduces the amount of confusion about networking, and it's just resources available to you at your fingertips.
Well, this is exciting. We've had a lot of calls, and I'm sure there will be some more in our future segments. That's all the time we have for questions during this segment. Now, you'll see Autumn and Frank. They're going to be back after the next segment to take more of your questions. I know that you have to leave now, Autumn, for our next set of Windows 95 demos. Remember, you can call 206-635-7066 anytime during today's show. Our Windows 95 engineers are there to answer your questions and pass a few of them along to us, and we'll use them on the show. Now, please feel free to call right now, 206-635-7066. A key feature of Windows 95 is integrated support for your network client. In this next section, Autumn will walk us through the configuration of the client for Microsoft Networks. Autumn?
In this segment, I plan to cover configuring the client for Microsoft Networks, the NetBEUI protocol, IPX protocol, and TCP/IP protocols, and troubleshooting tips for each of these components. I'd like to focus on configuring the client first. We'll talk about configuring the server later in this program. When you're configuring the client, and to get some properties about the client, you typically could start from Control Panel. From the Start button, Settings, Control Panel, we click on the network icon, and this brings up all our information about configuring our network. Let me just quickly go back and show you a shortcut to get to this. I can highlight the network neighborhood, secondary mouse click, and select Properties, and this brings up the same window. You'll notice we have three tabs. We have a Configuration tab, an Identification tab, and an Access Control tab. We'll go through each one of these in more detail. From the Configuration tab, you'll notice that we list the components that are currently installed in our PC. You'll also notice we have a primary login option. It is currently set to Client for Microsoft Networks. We have another option for Windows Logon. Basically, what the primary network logon does is tells you which is the first screen that the user is going to be confronted with. If you want them to enter information about the client for Microsoft Networks, such as domain name or workgroup name, we would select Client for Microsoft Networks. If you didn't want the user to be confronted with all that network-specific information and just log on to Windows, you can select Windows Logon as your primary network logon. But because we're focusing on networking, we'll keep it at Client for Microsoft Networks. We're going to talk in more detail about each of these properties in a few minutes, but let's bring your attention to the identification page. This is where we input the computer name, and in this case it's main_PC. And we also enter the workgroup name, and in this case the workgroup name is Traincast. And of course, this is where you can have a computer description. Now, if we wanted to get information about the client for Microsoft Networks, we can highlight that option, Client for Microsoft Nets, and click on Properties. Here you'll notice that we've got information about validation from a Windows NT domain, for example, and network logon options, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. One thing I want to point out is that we can enable or disable this logon to Windows NT domain. If we enable this, as the screen tells us, when you log on, your password will be verified on a Windows NT domain. And the Windows NT domain name happens to also be called Traincast. Windows 95 uses a workgroup model. Workgroups are used merely for administrative groupings when browsing machines. Machines in a workgroup only administer the security of its own machine. Domains, like a Windows NT server, for example, administer the security of multiple machines. Again, Windows 95 uses a workgroup model. In other words, a Windows 95 machine would never be configured to be a domain controller. During setup, the workgroup name can be selected from a list in the workgroup INI file. That file is spelled wrkgrp.ini. So when the user installs Windows 95, they can select which workgroup to be part of. Even though Windows 95 uses a workgroup model, users can be validated by a Windows NT or LAN manager domain, as Windows for Workgroups did. And as you see here, if you wanted them to be validated, all you need to do is check this checkbox. And again, it will default to the workgroup name, and if it's different for a domain name, you can enter a different name here. Another great thing about Windows 95 is administrators have the option to lock users out of Windows and/or the network if they are not validated by a domain controller. We'll talk in more detail in the System Management program later in this series about all the options administrators have to disable functionality in Windows 95, but I will give you a sneak preview of what they can do. I'm going to run a program called PolEdit. It's our policy editor. You'll notice I've highlighted the default computer icon. We also have settings for default user specific. When I click on the default computer icon, I can select network, and you'll notice I have several options here. One for logon. Here's where I can select require validation by network for Windows access. I can also modify some options for the various clients. For Microsoft Client for Windows networks, I could enable logon to Windows NT and enter the domain name, such as Traincast. And if I wanted to, I can enable display domain logon confirmation. So when a user logs in to the Windows NT domain, and if they are successfully validated, we will display a message stating that they were validated. We also can enable or disable caching of a domain password for more security. The information from the policy editor is copied into a file called msbatch.inf. There's a lot of details about msbatch.inf in the resource kit, and I recommend that you view the resource kit for those details. Windows 95 provides 32-bit protected mode clients out of the box. This includes the network provider and the redirector components, which we talked about earlier. So when I speak of the client, I'm talking about the two architectural components, the network provider and the redirector. Let's go ahead and take a look at the components that are installed in this PC. Remember, the quick and easy way to view the network components is to highlight the network neighborhood, select Properties, and here you are. If we want to add clients, we select the client, Add, and you'll notice we have a list of several manufacturers that are supported in Windows 95, such as Artisoft and Banyan. Let's take a look at the Microsoft components. Microsoft ships out of the box a protected mode client for Microsoft Networks, a protected mode client for netware networks, which we'll talk about in much more detail in our later program, and a real mode MSNet compatible driver for backwards compatibility to other networks such as LAN Manager 2X. Now these are drivers that we ship. I want to bring your attention to Microsoft's protected mode client for netware networks. This is Microsoft's driver, and these are protected mode. This client for netware networks is very different than Novell's real mode clients. You'll notice that I selected Novell under the manufacturers, and under the network clients we show the Novell real mode clients. You'll see the workstation shell 3X for NetX and the shell for 4.0 VLM. Again, if you wanted to use the protected mode components, you'd have to select Microsoft, and here are your options: client for Microsoft networks and client for netware networks. You'll also notice we have several third-party manufacturers that make their components available, and Sun Select is the last one on the list for their PC NFS client. Something to point out is all the information that we're seeing here makes it easy for a user to install for third-party network components out of the box. However, this information is coming from an INF file, the information files, which are submitted to us by these vendors. Microsoft is not shipping drivers for any of these third-party networks. The only drivers Microsoft are shipping are the ones listed under Microsoft. If you do decide to install Windows 95 on top of a third-party network operating system, I would recommend that you install the third-party operating system first, and then Windows 95 setup can detect those components and integrate their settings into the Windows 95 registry as appropriate. Currently, the third-party components shipping in Windows 95 are the only real mode pieces, but vendors can develop their own 32-bit components. As a matter of fact, some of the top networking vendors have beta test copies today of their protected mode client software for integration into Windows 95. These new software products will provide users of Windows 95 connectivity with Banyan Vines, DEC Pathworks, and FTP Software's NFS servers. Windows 95 supports multiple 32-bit clients, but only one 16-bit client. For example, you can install both the client for Microsoft Nets and the client for netware networks, which are both 32-bit clients. If you wanted to install a protected mode Banyan Vines client, you could as well if it's a protected mode client. If you decide to install a real mode client, you can only install one real mode client, but as many protected mode clients as you want. A limitation with the 16-bit clients, in addition to, of course, taking up conventional memory because they're real mode network components, is you'll not be able to browse the servers from that 16-bit network operating system in the network neighborhood. Remember, our network neighborhood provides a list of servers available, but only because we have the protected mode network provider component. However, if you wanted to browse the servers from the real mode network operating system, you could use their real mode commands, such as netview. Netview, of course, is the Microsoft real mode command to view servers in your workgroup. Let's go into more detail about the client for Microsoft Networks. The client for Microsoft Networks provides services to applications such as mail slots and client-side named pipes. If an application needs server-side named pipes, that is not available in Windows 95. But the client-side named pipes and mail slots are part of the client for Microsoft Networks. The client for Microsoft Networks also includes an auto reconnect feature. This is a neat feature that was also available in Windows for Workgroups. So if a connection is lost to another server in the background, Windows 95 will try to reconnect to that server while you may be working on some other application. And this happens all automatically, transparent to the user, this auto reconnect feature. If we take a look at the properties for the client, again, we spoke of the logon validation to the Windows NT or LAN manager domain server. Now let's talk about the network logon options. By default, we select Quick Logon. As the screen tells us, this is when Windows logs you onto the network, but the network drives are not reconnected until you use them. So for example, if I have about a half a dozen persistent connections to several servers, when I boot up into Windows, we don't spend all that time trying to connect to the server, and if the server is not available, waiting the default of 60 seconds to time out and then come back and then try the next server. The boot time is very quick with this quick logon. If it was important to you to identify servers that are not available during the Windows 95 boot sequence, you could select Logon and Restore Network Connections. As the screen tells us, when you log onto the network, Windows verifies that each network drive is ready for use. So while you're logging on, if the server was not available, you would see a screen telling you the server's not up and running. Do you want to restore this connection for later boot up? The client from Microsoft Networks will use all three protocols: the IPX-SPX protocol, the NetBEUI protocol, and the TCP/IP protocol. Again, remember, this is all protected mode. Let's go ahead and talk about the protocols. As the network administrator, when deciding which protocols to install for your network environment, you should ask yourself a couple of questions. First question would be, which network operating system resources do you need to access, and what protocols are they running? So if I'm trying to access the Windows NT server, for example, and it's running NetBEUI, I would want to have NetBEUI installed on my Windows 95 machine so I can speak to that Windows NT server. The second question you want to ask yourself is, do you need a routable protocol so that you can access machines across a router? So if I'm trying to access that Windows NT server across a router, I would need a routable protocol such as IPX or TCP/IP. Keep in mind though, the more protocols you install, the more traffic you'll have on your network. So try to be efficient when deciding which protocols to install in your network environment. Let's go one by one for each of the protocols and talk about some details that maybe help you decide which to choose. The NetBEUI protocol runs off of a driver called NetBEUI VXD. This is a virtualized driver. NetBEUI gives you access to all the Microsoft network operating system machines, and it's typically used for small work groups, anywhere from about 20 to 200 machines in the work group. One limitation about NetBEUI, though, is it's not routable through a router. If you needed a routable protocol, you'd have to use either IPX or TCP/IP. NetBEUI includes the NetBIOS interface, so if you have any NetBIOS applications, like Lotus Notes for example, it can run over NetBEUI because it provides the NetBIOS interface. 16-bit applications would need another file called netbios.dll. This DLL provides additional support for 16-bit applications that make specific calls. One other thing to point out is in Windows for Workgroups, some applications were expecting to see an int5c call, and there were some issues with it being exposed to these applications. In Windows 95, a file called vNetBIOS, which virtualizes the NetBIOS interface, makes sure that the int5c call is returned to applications. Here we illustrate the different layers of support the NetBEUI protocol provides. We start with the NetBEUI stack, which includes the NDIS driver and the vNetBIOS layer. From the left, we'll note that we support Windows 16-bit NetBIOS applications, as well as Windows 32-bit NetBIOS applications, and of course, real-mode NetBIOS applications. Here's a troubleshooting tip for NetBIOS applications to keep in mind. Some NetBIOS applications rely on the data structure LANA 0. That's LANA 0. When transporting data over the network, if the expected transport or protocol, I'll use those terms interchangeably, if the expected transport is not set for LANA 0, the NetBIOS application may fail. Some NetBIOS applications are hard-coded to look for this data structure LAN 0. An easy way to set the protocol for LAN 0 in Windows 95 is to designate it as the default protocol in the user interface. Let me go ahead and show you how that's done. Here I highlight NetBEUI, for example, select Properties, and from the Advanced tab, you'll notice at the bottom we have the option to enable Set this protocol to be the default protocol. It's as simple as that. In older operating systems, you had to actually hack the protocol INI and make an entry for LAN 0, but it's as easy as this through the graphical interface. Let's move on to the IPX-SPX compatible protocol. IPX-SPX runs from a driver called nwlink.vxd, again another virtualized driver. IPX gives you access to NetWare file servers and most Microsoft network operating systems except for LAN Manager. So IPX-SPX will give you connection to Windows for Workgroups and Windows NT machines, as well as, of course, other Windows 95 machines. Another great thing about IPX is it's routable over NetWare file servers. So you can have an existing NetWare file server in the shop, and you can route without having to reconfigure anything. You can also route IPX over Windows NT servers as well, and other routers that are configured to route the IPX protocol. One thing to note, though, is Windows 95 will not support internal IPX routing between two net cards. We do support routing between a net card and the dial-up server, and we'll talk more about the dial-up issues in our mobile program following the series. Let's talk about the interfaces for IPX-SPX. Windows 95 supports ECB, which is Event Control Block, NetBIOS, and Windows sockets. Let's go through each of these one by one. ECB, which is Event Control Block, gives us the option to direct host over the IPX protocol. So the Windows 95 protected mode redirector can speak directly to the IPX protocol with its native interface. So there's no extra overhead for a NetBIOS mapping layer, for example. So Windows 95 directs hosts over the IPX protocol, similar to how Novell NetWare direct hosts over its IPX protocol. Its redirector, NetX, speaks directly to its IPX protocol. But in Windows 95, we do it in protected mode. Windows 95 also supports the NetBIOS interface over IPX. NetBIOS is not installed by default, but is available if you have NetBIOS applications that need it. One good reason why we've decided not to install NetBIOS by default is if a router is pre-configured to route IPX packets, they would need to pre-configure the packet type for those packets that are routed with NetBIOS. So in other words, the packet type would have to change to packet type 20 if you routed NetBIOS over IPX. Another issue with NetBIOS over IPX is it is required if you're trying to connect to a Windows NT 3.1 machine, because the Windows NT 3.1 machines do not direct host over IPX. In other words, they don't use the ECB interface. So they are required to use the NetBIOS interface. So if my Windows 95 machine does not have NetBIOS over IPX, I may be unable to connect to other Windows NT machines if they're version 3.1 and they're required to connect using the IPX protocol. Something to keep in mind. But let me show you something in the user interface to hopefully clarify some issues with the default protocol I just showed you a few moments ago with respect to that LAN 0 entry for NetBIOS applications. Currently, I have IPX installed without NetBIOS, again, the default. If I select Properties and go to the Advanced tab, you'll notice the option to set the protocol to be the default protocol is grayed out. Well, the reason this is grayed out is because, again, remember this sets that LAN 0 data structure. Well, LAN 0 is really a NetBIOS type of attribute. So first I have to enable NetBIOS. All I did was go to the NetBIOS page and I want to enable NetBIOS over IPX. When I go back to the advanced page, you'll notice that it's no longer grayed out, and I can select set this protocol to be the default protocol. So again, if you want to set the IPX protocol to be the default protocol and have it set for LAN 0, make sure NetBIOS is enabled. Let's go ahead and talk about Windows sockets. Windows 95 now includes Windows sockets over IPX, but specifically 32-bit apps would be using the Windows sockets interface over IPX. The component that makes that work is a driver called WS-IPX for Windows sockets over IPX. If I have a 16-bit application that wants to use sockets, we'd have to use the TCP/IP interface, and I'll talk to you about that in a few minutes. Here we illustrate the different layers of support the IPX-SPX protocol provides. Again, we start with the IPX stack, which is NWLink, and the NDIS components. Again, these are all protected mode. Then you'll notice Windows 95 has support for 32-bit Windows sockets applications, applications that direct host over IPX, such as our redirector, 16-bit Windows NetBIOS applications, as well as 32-bit Windows NetBIOS applications, and of course, real mode NetBIOS applications, all over the IPX transport. When troubleshooting connectivity issues with IPX, something to keep in mind. IPX uses something called a frame type setting. Let's take a look at the properties for IPX. And when I go into advanced, you notice we have several different properties for IPX. We're going to talk about the frame type setting. By default, Windows 95 sets this to auto. This is a lot less overwhelming to users than trying to select one of these other frame types that may not mean anything to some of these users. Auto works like this. Basically, Windows 95, when it boots up, monitors the network line for responses from RIP requests, which is the routing information packet that's specific to IPX. So basically, we're monitoring the line and we're taking a look at what frame types are on the line. Basically, the most popular frame type is the one that we pick. In other words, if most of the frame types are 802.3, we're assuming you're on a network and you would need to be running 802.3. But a troubleshooting tip is if you're not able to connect to other machines running IPX and you suspect it may be the frame type, you should come into this value field and select whatever the specific frame type the server you're trying to connect to is running. So for example, if you're going to use Ethernet 802.3, set this to 802.3 and make sure your server is also running the exact same frame type. Let's move on to TCP/IP. TCP/IP uses the support of two 386 drivers, vTCP.386 and vIP.386. The whole suite of TCP/IP components, including ARP and ICMP and UDP, are all part of the TCP component. The great thing about TCP/IP, which I know a lot of people are very excited about in Windows 95, is it'll give you access to the internet. And that, of course, is going to be a great thing. Another good thing about TCP/IP is that it is a routable protocol and can route using a Windows NT server or any other TCP/IP configured router. TCP/IP is also using the NetBIOS interface if NetBIOS applications need it, and it is supported in Windows 95. For those of you who may have configured the real mode TCP/IP protocol, you may recall of a driver or component called TinyRFC. TinyRFC is now replaced with a protected mode component in Windows 95, and it is called VNB for NetBIOS T.386. In Windows 95, we also support Windows sockets over TCP/IP, both for 16-bit apps and 32-bit applications. And the VXD that gives us the Windows socket support over TCP/IP is a file called wstcp.vxd. In Windows 95, we also support a new interface called TDI. This is the transport driver interface that debuted with Windows NT. So if you have any TDI applications, they will be supported in Windows 95 over the TCP/IP protocol. And the driver that provides that support is vTDI.386. Here we illustrate the different layers of support the TCP/IP protocol provides. First, of course, we start with the TCP stack, which includes the vTCP, VIP, and NDIS drivers. And then you'll notice that Windows 95 supports TDI applications, Windows 16-bit and 32-bit sockets applications, and NetBIOS applications. Let's go into some detail about how TCP/IP is configured. Here in my network configuration page, I have TCP/IP highlighted, and I'll select the Properties button. You'll notice TCP/IP right off the bat is a little bit more complicated to configure than NetBEUI and IPX. The first page that comes up is the IP address, and we'll talk about in detail DHCP servers and how Windows 95 acts as a DHCP agent. We'll also talk about WINS configuration, setting your default gateway address, how this protocol could be a default protocol. We'll talk about bindings in a few minutes as well. And of course, we'll need to talk about DNS configuration for our domain name service. Coming back to the IP address page, Windows 95 by default will select to obtain an IP address from a DHCP server. This is a great thing for administrators as well as users trying to configure their machines with TCP/IP. Obtaining an IP address from a DHCP server makes it extremely easy for administrators to lease IP addresses to various workstations and not needing to keep track on a piece of paper what IP addresses are assigned to whom. It's all automatic and done by a DHCP server. And your Windows NT machine is acting as a DHCP server in this case. We'll also go into some details about the TCP/IP utilities that are shipping in the box in Windows 95. I'm going to keep talking about DHCP because it's a great thing, and if you haven't heard about it, you should probably read some details, maybe some white papers that are up on TechNet, for example, our TechNet CDs. But I will tell you a few details. First of all, again, DHCP servers make administering TCP/IP configuration more manageable. For example, if I took my laptop to Hawaii, for example, and plugged it into the network, I would obtain an IP address dynamically without having to reconfigure anything. Then if I came back to work and I plugged into my corporate network environment, I would obtain the other IP address that would be specific to my local network environment. Again, I don't have to configure anything. It acts as an agent to a DHCP server. It finds a DHCP server on the network, such as a Windows NT 3.5 machine, and dynamically gets assigned an IP address. Not only do we dynamically assign it an IP address, but you'll notice the subnet mask is also taken care of, as well as the default gateway. So all three of those fields are taken care of automatically with a DHCP server. One thing to keep in mind is if my Windows 95 workstation did not find a DHCP server on the network, the user would get prompted a message that no DHCP server was found and your TCP/IP address was not configured. The way DHCP allocates IP addresses is through a lease arrangement. Basically, we can lease out an IP address for a period of time, which is designated by the administrator on the NT server. Now you may ask yourself, well, this is all great. Sure, the user has automatically and dynamically configured an IP address and the default gateway and the subnet mask. But now I'm trying to troubleshoot some issues, and I don't know what my IP address is. Well, it's easy. If you've ever used TCP/IP and you're trying to do some troubleshooting for IP addresses, you've probably run a utility called ipconfig. Well, let me go ahead and type in ipconfig. And when I press enter, oh, it's telling me you can't find ipconfig. Well, how in the world can you ship TCP/IP without ipconfig? Well, this is Windows, remember? We ship a Windows graphical user interface version of ipconfig called WinIPconfig. And this is a lot friendlier to users. You'll notice it's graphical. It gives me all the information I need to know, such as my IP address, which in this case, this Windows 95 workstation has been dynamically assigned the IP address of 100.100.100.2. Yes, I know, that's very friendly. Subnet mask. Here it is, 255.255.0.0, and our default gateway. The default gateway address in this case, which is 100.100.100.1, is pointing to that Windows NT machine. If I wanted to get more information, you can see it also lists for me the IP address for my DHCP server and the IP address for my Win servers, as well as when the lease for this IP address was obtained. Another good piece of information, if you're interested in the hardware address for your netcard adapter, is also here under adapter address. And it even tells me which netcard I'm running. So this is a pretty useful tool. As a matter of fact, let me just show you one other quick thing. If I wanted to release this IP address because I'm suspecting that maybe this IP address is in conflict with another machine that may have the same IP address, I can just click the button, Release, and I've released my IP addressing. If I wanted to renew the address, I just click Renew, and I'm dynamically renewed a new IP address. It's as easy as a click of a button. Let's go ahead and move on to WINS. But first, let me bring up the network configuration dialog. Again, the shortcut is clicking the network neighborhood with my secondary mouse button, selecting properties. Let me go ahead and highlight TCP/IP, selecting properties, and let's select the WINS configuration page. Well, what is WINS all about? WINS is the Windows Internetwork Naming Service. Basically what this is a server, or basically a protocol used for servers, to resolve NetBIOS names to IP addresses. When you're in the Unix environment, you resolve not NetBIOS names, but Unix host names to IP addresses, and that's done with DNS servers, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Getting back to WINS, WINS will enable the ability to resolve NetBIOS names to IP addresses. NetBIOS names are used for NetBIOS applications. So for example, Lotus Notes is a NetBIOS application, and if it wants to speak to a particular machine, it will use a NetBIOS name. If I'm trying to connect to another Windows 95 machine, I would use the NetBIOS name, such as Win95PC, as opposed to typing in an unfriendly IP address like 100.100.100.3. Okay? WINS also reduces local broadcast traffic for these name resolutions, so that the WINS server, which in this case is the Windows NT machine behind me, it resolves all the IP resolutions, and I don't have to broadcast on the network for a machine to respond to tell me that it is the NetBIOS machine I'm looking for. All that's handled by one machine and reduces broadcast traffic. Another great thing about WINS is it dynamically updates the IP address for NetBIOS names when configured with DHCP. So for example, if this Windows 95 machine is dynamically getting an IP address, that IP address is dynamically updated with its NetBIOS name on the WINS server. So WINS works hand in hand with DHCP to keep track of NetBIOS names to machines that are getting new IP addresses every time they may boot up. Windows 95 supports 2 WINS servers, which are used globally for all bindings of TCP/IP. For example, if I select Enable WINS Resolution, and I happen to know the specific IP addresses for my primary WINS server and secondary WINS server, these addresses would be global for each binding of TCP/IP. What I mean by binding of TCP/IP, I'm referring to multiple net cards. In this case, I only have one net card, so therefore I only have one binding of TCP/IP. If I had a second net card, I would have a second binding of TCP/IP, and these WINS servers would apply to both bindings of TCP/IP. You'll notice by default, we use the DHCP server for WINS resolution, which means that by default, if I have a DHCP server, it will also be responsible for the WINS resolution. Browsing over IP routers, in other words, routers configured to browse TCP/IP, typically require an LM hosts file with a number sign DOM entry for domain. One great thing about WINS is it replaces the LM host file, so you no longer need to have these files with a DOM entry. You could still have them. We'll work with both, the LM host file and the WINS server, but the WINS server will handle basically everything the LM host file did for you. Another great thing about WINS is you'll have no more stranded workgroups that can't get a browse list. Remember, the LM host file only allowed you to make entries for domains. If you had a workgroup and those poor servers out in the workgroup wanted to get a browse list of IP servers across a router, they're out of luck. Well, if those workgroup servers are WINS aware, in other words, those workgroup machines are either running the protected mode TCP/IP for Windows for Workgroups, or Windows 95, or Windows NT. In other words, if all those machines are WINS aware, they have a WINS agent, even if they're in a workgroup, they still will be able to browse TCP/IP servers if you have a WINS server in the house. Let's move on to DNS. DNS is the domain name service, and these servers are used to resolve Unix host names to IP addresses. A Unix host name could be the same as a NetBIOS name, but the Unix host name is used for TCP utilities, such as ping and telnet, for example. One thing to point out with Windows 95 and how the algorithm works when searching DNS information versus information in a hosts file is that in Windows 95, we actually query the hosts file first, and then the DNS server. You probably know that the host file contains all the Unix host names which resolve to a particular IP address. And you probably also remember that entries in the host file are case sensitive, something to keep in mind when troubleshooting IP addressing resolution to Unix host names. You can notice here when we enable DNS that we actually can add multiple DNS servers. In WINS, we allowed a primary and a secondary, but with DNS, we can have more than 2 DNS servers. Keep in mind, if you're going to enter a DNS server, you have to click Add for it to be entered in the table. Just like WINS, DNS servers are also global for multiple bindings of TCP/IP. So again, if you have TCP/IP bound to one net card and TCP/IP bound to, let's say, your dial-up adapter, again, we'll get into mobile in a later program, but dial-up adapter is what lets you get out to the internet, for example, through your modem. If you have TCP/IP bound to both of those cards, this DNS server will be used for both bindings. In other words, you cannot assign a DNS server to one binding and then another DNS server to another binding. They're global for all bindings of TCP/IP. Let's talk about the utilities Windows 95 ships for TCP/IP. Of course, we ship the FTP utility, which is your file transfer protocol. This allows you to transfer files from a server running the FTP service. Of course, there are many FTP servers out on the internet, and right out of the box, you can use the FTP utility to connect to those servers on the internet. Windows 95 also ships Telnet, which is your terminal emulation connectivity to a Unix host. And of course, we ship the diagnostic utility Ping. Ping, of course, is what lets you check the host name, the TCP configuration, physical connection, and remote TCP resources. Ping will have to be run from an MS-DOS prompt. We also ship NetStat, which is another diagnostic tool used to display the statistics for the state of the current TCP connection. It's a lot of little lower level goo kind of stuff. Ping is really what you'll probably use when you're troubleshooting to try to see if you can connect to another host. Similar to NetStat, we have NBStat. That's another diagnostic utility that displays the state of a NetBIOS over TCP connection. We also ship ARP, which is your address resolution protocol, to hardware ID. In other words, my net card on this Windows 95 PC has a very specific and unique hardware ID. That hardware ID needs to be resolved to the IP address that I was assigned. Well, all this information is kept in an ARP table, and the ARP utility allows you to detect invalid entries in that ARP table on the local computer. Windows 95 also ships the TraceRT utility, which allows you to check the route to a remote computer. And I showed you earlier the WinIPconfig utility, which allows you to display, renew, and release TCP configuration addresses. Well, I just finished talking about configuring the client for Microsoft Networks and the protocols, IPX, NetBEUI, and TCP. I'd like to spend a few minutes on some generic network installation issues that I think would be helpful for you. When installing Windows 95 on your PC, there are two ways we can approach the configuration of the network. We can either add the network card after Windows 95 is installed, or we can install Windows 95 over an existing network operating system that's already in place. Let's start with adding the network adapter after Windows 95 is installed. If it was a plug-and-play network adapter, Windows 95 would identify it automatically and actually give you a dialog that says, "We've just detected new hardware." Well, when you're detecting new hardware, or anytime you've got new hardware added on your machine, you should always check Device Manager. There's a couple of ways to get to Device Manager, and I think Johnny Lindsay in the setup program probably showed this to you. The shortcut is to highlight the My Computer icon on your desktop with the secondary mouse click, select Properties, and from the System Properties icon, select Device Manager page. These are all the devices on your PC. As you see, the computer is highlighted, and I have a CD-ROM, as well as, of course, disk drives, display adapter, but of course we're most interested in the network adapter. So I can click the plus sign beside the network adapter, and you'll notice it tells me I have an Intel EtherExpress 16 network card. Well, I can select Properties for that and select the resource page after noting that the device status tells me this device is working properly. Well, that's good news. If I check the resource page, you'll notice it tells me what interrupt request, or IRQ, it's set for, and what input-output range it's set for. Another great thing about Windows 95 is if I wanted to change the setting, let's say the IRQ, just in case you didn't catch that, I just highlighted the interrupt request, select the Change Setting button, and I come up to Edit Interrupt Request. The great thing about Windows 95, especially this Device Manager, which I'm sure will help out on a lot of support calls, is it'll tell me whether or not this IRQ setting is in conflict with any other adapter. It tells me no other devices are conflicting. Let's say I wanted to change the IRQ for some reason. If I change it by just scrolling, it'll tell me that this particular IRQ is currently set for this particular device. In this case, it's the Adaptec SCSI host adapter. If I continue to scroll up, it tells me that IRQ3 is set for my COM port, and I can keep scrolling to look for something that's available. In this case, it tells me IRQ5 seems to be available because it's not conflicting with any devices. But let's bring it back to 10. So again, my point is to show you Device Manager, because anytime you install new hardware, you should probably check to make sure it's not conflicting and is in fact running properly. Here's a troubleshooting tip to keep in mind. When you can't see a server, in other words, my workstation's trying to connect to another machine acting as a server, you may want to check the adapter setting for specifically the transceiver type. What's this transceiver type? Well, let's take a look. Again, I'm taking the properties of my network neighborhood. I find my adapter and highlight it, select Properties, and let's go into Advanced. One of the properties for this particular net card is transceiver type. In this case, it's set to twisted pair, and that's in fact what I'm using is twisted pair for my net card. If I was using coax, I can select coax. It's important that the transceiver type is correct, because if the bits are coming out of the net card and are expecting to travel on a particular type of wire, such as twisted pair, they'll be, let's say, encoded a little bit differently on a twisted pair line than they would be on a coax line. So you wouldn't get any errors when you boot up about any IRQ conflicts or initializing the adapter, but your bits on the wire are not going to be coded properly if the transceiver type is incorrect. And I know from experience this has fixed quite a few issues for me trying to connect to a server. So again, make sure the transceiver type is correct. And I'm going to set it back to twisted pair. If Windows 95 setup runs on a machine which already had a net card adapter installed, it is detected in one of two ways. Windows 95 uses this great thing called safe detection. Safe detection pretty much kind of avoids any kind of machine lockups you may have during setup, which you may have experienced in previous versions of installing an operating system. What safe detection does is it gets hints from configuration files. In our case, the network configuration file would be protocol INI. If Windows 95 setup doesn't find a protocol INI, in other words, it doesn't find any hints about your network card, it'll prompt a screen for the user and ask them if they know a network adapter exists. If the user knows they have a network adapter, they can select and enable to find this network adapter. With safe detection, if the user knows they don't have a network adapter, then we won't be poking I/O ports for a response. So that's a great thing, and it avoids a lot of machine lockups that you normally would have with net card detection. Another thing to keep in mind when you're upgrading over Windows for Workgroups is that Windows 95 setup will accept the same configuration from an upgrade from Windows 95. For example, we'll accept the same client, server, and protocols. A good thing the administrators are probably happy about is in Windows 95 setup, if you install to a clean directory, the server is not installed by default. So unless you upgrade over a Windows for Workgroups machine that already has the server installed, the server will not be installed by default. Again, to make the installation process easy for users, the administrator can create an automated installation. The Windows 95 Resource Kit covers these steps in a lot of good detail. I will point out that the Protected Mode client for Microsoft Nets, as we noticed earlier, will allow you to be validated to a Windows NT domain, as well as a LAN manager domain, which means that we will run the login scripts from these domain controllers. Two files, one called lmscript.exe and the other called lmscript.pif, are used to launch these login script batch files from within an MS-DOS session. Because of course the login scripts are typically ending in a BAT extension and they will have to be run from an MS-DOS session. Windows 95 supports a server-based installation option where the Windows 95 workstation has only the user files on the local hard drive or a floppy disk. So in other words, we have a minimum number of files that we need to connect to the network so that we can find the server that has all the system files. For a server-based setup, Windows 95 creates a mini registry because you remember that Windows 95 uses a full database to contain all the system and user settings called the registry. Well, we probably can't fit that entire registry onto a floppy diskette. So just for server-based setup, Windows 95 creates a mini registry so it can find just enough that it needs to connect to the network. The registry keys used are only those necessary to get the machine up and running on the real mode network so it can connect to the server with all the Windows 95 system files. Well, let's go back to Elliot so we can take some more of your calls. When I come back, I'll go through some troubleshooting tips to resolve network connectivity problems and discuss how to configure Windows 95 as a server.
Thanks, Autumn. There's an awful lot of valuable information there. I'm certainly going to enjoy taking advantage of some of the new features in Windows 95. Let's ask that question again, that contest question, because I don't want you to pass up your chance to win your Dell system. Here's a question. Name one, and you've heard her talk about it, name one of the network protocols supported by Windows 95. The number to call with your answer is 1-800-254-4069. Autumn, I was wondering, in Windows for Workgroups, a user could browse their workgroup for specific machines and shares. How is browsing different in Windows 95, and how does the user go about browsing for a network resource either in their own group or in another group?
Yeah, that's a good question, Elliot. Windows for Workgroups users, when they went into File Manager, they probably noticed a Browse button. And in Windows 95, when you're browsing for resources, all you need to do is just click on the network neighborhood, and browsing just happens automatically. So you wouldn't expect to see a browse button.
I see. And we talked about that when we were doing some rehearsal yesterday, that browse button's history now.
That browse button is history in Windows 95. And as a matter of fact, it's kind of a good thing because in Windows 95, we don't browse the entire network like we did in Windows for Workgroups from File Manager. So we're very efficient about, we're just browsing the servers in our workgroup. And if we did want to browse the entire network and send packets throughout the entire network, we can click the entire network icon.
Focused browsing.
Right, yes, exactly.
Okay, let's welcome back Frank Ramirez to answer some more questions. Now, I want to remind you that the Windows 95 engineers will continue to take their calls throughout the show, and I want you to call. It's really interesting when you guys call and you put them on the spot, but they have wonderful answers for you. So call. Remember, 206-635-7066. Well, I actually had one call, and I'm going to put myself on the spot because Farron from Charlotte called, and they were interested in how do they actually maybe get a tape of this show. And I was given the number to call, 1-800-597-3200, and that's your way in which you can order some videotapes. Well, one of the interesting things is we do have a live caller on the line, and we have Richard from Pennsylvania. Richard, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Richard. Where in Pennsylvania are you?
I'm in Bensalem.
Okay. Richard, do you want to ask your question to our gang here?
Yes. Hello, Autumn.
Hey, Richard.
Hello.
Hi, Richard.
I want to ask if can we use NetWare's ARC console on a Windows 95 workstation to manage a NetWare 312 file server?
Okay. Thank you very much, Richard. And the answer is?
Okay, in Windows 95, we are testing all Novell utilities to run. Keep in mind, of course, in Windows 95, out of the box, we can speak to Novell servers, so there's no problem using the Novell utilities from a Windows 95 machine speaking to a Novell file server. And our console is definitely being tested, and as far as I'm concerned, as I'm aware now, of course the product hasn't shipped yet, that it is supported and working in Windows 95. And again, we are testing all Novell utilities to make sure that we're covering all our bases here.
Frank, while we're on the topic of Novell, we had a call from Mitch in Colorado and wanted to see if you would be willing, and as a product manager, if you talk a little bit about Novell's claim that ODI is faster than NDIS.
Yeah, I think the opinion we are here at Microsoft is that the types of performance issue that's raised here is really something that the end users, it's a decision the end users should be making, and it's not something we should be making claims towards, because there are a lot of benchmarks out there, and essentially they can be manipulated in many different ways, and so we feel much more comfortable with the end user to make that kind of decision. But I can tell you that we're working with Novell right now on a daily basis, obviously, to try and make the best client we possibly can for Novell NetWare.
You know, we get calls in a lot of ways, and one of the most unusual ways, I got a call about 20 minutes ago on my text beeper from a colleague of mine. I'm not going to give you that number for sure, but a colleague of mine, Eric, in Aurora, New York, wanted to know something, and this is right to the heart of corporate America. Autumn, Eric wants to know, can they play Doom over the network using Windows 95?
Well, I tell you what, it's been tested on campus quite a bit, as a matter of fact, and I've seen it working and running, and I guess we do, in fact, officially support Doom. It uses the IPX protocol, and we have protected mode support for IPX, so it's happening over the network.
Okay, techies, you heard it here. This is what you get from Traincast. Up to the minute breaking news. Frank, where can Bill from Oregon want to know where they can get an updated resource kit for Windows 95, perhaps over the internet?
Actually, we have a beta version of the resource kit available right now, as you well know, and we're not planning on coming out with another version until launch. And at launch, there'll be a new release. If you're interested in getting it over the internet, I mean, there's a couple different ways. You can go to CompuServe, for example, and I think the key there is Go Win News. If you go to America Online, I think the jump there is another Win News type of jump, and then there's always FTP at Microsoft.com that you can dial into, and you can get information there also.
Probably it's the mother of all files.
It is actually. It's a big file.
It's a big mama. So, Autumn, we had a call from Dylan in St. Louis. Dylan would like to know what systems management tools are actually going to be shipping with Windows 95.
Yeah, Windows 95 ships a number of different utilities that system managers can use. As a matter of fact, later in this program, I'll be demonstrating some of those tools. In particular, what I'll be talking about is NetWatcher, which allows you to see what machines are connected to you as a server. System Monitor tracks activity of your local machine, of network activity, as well as just local kernel activity. And the Resource Kit, of course, is a great utility to use and just get some information about how the network operating system works. And then, of course, the specific protocols, of which I won't name any, but we have some utilities for those protocols as well.
I see. And talking about management tools, let me do a little learner management. In just a couple of minutes, you'll be able to go to the facilities or take a break. We have a few more questions, and then we'll be taking a 10-minute break. Another question came in from Diane in Topeka, Kansas, and I know maybe Autumn, you want to handle this, which is, Diane wants to know how do they bypass the Windows 95 login dialog. Is there any route around that?
Yeah, that's a common question. A lot of people don't want to be prompted with a login as soon as they launch Windows 95. Let me just explain one thing. If you're in a workgroup environment, a workgroup model, where you're not relying on a domain controller to validate your user access, then in a workgroup model, you do not have to be prompted for a login. In a domain model, it would be different. You would still have to respond to a domain server. But the way to launch Windows 95 without being prompted for a login is to just set your password to a null password or a blank, empty password. And when you launch Windows, it'll assume you as the default user and not ask you for a password. And now you have Windows access and network access in the workgroup.
Okay, we have two real quick answers for you, Frank. John from the 306 area code wanted to know, A, how does Win95 handle conventional memory better than Win 3.1? And Frank wants to know how he can get onto his own information superhighway. Can he connect to the internet through Win95?
Yes, he will be able to connect to the internet. I'll take the second question first. We're shipping the TCP/IP protocol stack and also the WinSockets interface. So, I mean, you will be actually to use applications that are specifically designed to access the internet. For example, the Mosaic and the NetWatcher type of applications. And the first question regarding conventional memory, since all the applications on Windows 95 are run in protect mode, the footprint that you have in conventional mode is nil, essentially. So, I mean, that's essentially the benefit that he'll be realizing. Well,
I want to thank you both, and they're going to be back in a later segment to answer your questions, and we love getting them. So once again, the number is 206-635-7066. We're going to be taking a 10-minute break in just a few moments, and then we're going to go on to the next section. You may want to have a pen and paper ready, as we're about to show you a number of the Microsoft Windows 95 resources and how you can get them. We still have a whole lot of material to cover today, so stretch, and then remember that during the show you can continue to call us. We want to hear your questions, and it's 206-635-7066. Now we're going to stop taking questions on that line at the end of the show. So watch now how you can get all of the wonderful Windows 95 products and resources. And we'll be back in about 10 minutes.
If you'd like to subscribe to Microsoft's Win News electronic newsletter, send internet email to enews@microsoft.nwnet.com with the words "Subscribe Win News" as the only text in the body of your message. Win News file sections can also be found on most major online services and networks. There are a number of electronic distribution points that contain information directly from Microsoft about Windows 95. Use the following electronic addresses for new white papers, press releases, and other documentation. The transcript, content outline, and PowerPoint slides of this broadcast will be available on CompuServe and the World Wide Web at these addresses. To receive the Microsoft project template for deployment of Windows 95, send your name, company name, address, phone, and fax numbers via the internet to deploy95@microsoft.com. The Microsoft project template is also available on CompuServe, Go, MSTV Forum, Windows 95 Library. The title is Win95p.zip. To receive a beta version of the Windows 95 Resource Kit, or for information, call 1-800-MS-PRESS. Inside Windows 95 by Adrian King is available for $24.95 at most major bookstores, or by calling 1-800-MS-PRESS. To get a program guide for Microsoft TV with information on business-to-business television programs from Microsoft, email us at mstv@microsoft.com or call 1-800-597-3200. To order a videotape of today's program or any others in the Windows 95 Traincast series, call 1-800-597-3200. We'll be back with more of Windows 95 Traincast in a few minutes. In the meantime, our Traincast question and answer phone lines are still open. Call 206-635-7066. You still have an opportunity to enter our contest to win a complete multimedia computer system from Dell. Simply answer the following question. Name one of the network protocols supported by Microsoft Windows 95. When you know the answer, call us toll-free at 800-254-4069. Once again, name one of the network protocols supported by Microsoft Windows 95. Windows 95 Traincast will return in a few moments.
Microsoft TV, the right information right now. People in the business community need information on technology. Because of the great changes taking place almost daily, Microsoft TV has emerged as one of the best sources for technology information and computer television programming. Microsoft TV features a variety of shows for the computer industry and business professionals. First, we have the Microsoft Distributed Computing series that takes a look at integrating Microsoft back-office tools and applications into businesses of all sizes. The Microsoft Office Solutions Show features the Microsoft Office product as a business platform. We show you how to make decisions easier and faster. The popular DevCast show is now a monthly series. featuring stuff that software developers of all kinds can sink their teeth into. This is a fairly technical show, but has appealed to both the developer and business audience. A new program on the horizon is called the Win95 Traincast series. More than 30 hours of programming are being developed to provide education and problem solving concerning the rollout of Windows 95 later this year. The business TV audience needs technology information, and that's where Microsoft TV fits into your schedule. The right information, right now.
Welcome back to Windows 95 Traincast, the program designed to prepare you for the move to and implementation of Microsoft's Windows 95. Windows 95 Traincast is sponsored in part by Dell Computer Corporation. For a chance to win a complete Dell multimedia computer system, just answer the following question. Name one of the network protocols supported by Microsoft Windows 95. When you know the answer, call us toll-free at 800-254-4069. Again, name one of the network protocols supported by Microsoft Windows 95. Once again, here's Elliot Mazie.
It's true, the coffee is good out here in Washington State. Welcome back to Microsoft's Windows 95 Traincast. If you're just joining us, we've already covered two important areas you will not want to miss. If you did miss the first two segments of this program, all's not lost. Videotapes of this program and all the other programs to date in the Windows 95 Traincast series are available for Microsoft TV and can be ordered by calling 1-800-597-3200. Now let's move forward. In the past, PC and network managers faced several challenges when installing Windows on the network server. network managers had to manage a number of variables such as having local swapping files and local INIs and applications, allowing user-level configurations and supporting disparate hardware configurations. Autumn is now going to tell us how configuring and running Windows 95 from a server has become much simpler. Autumn?
In this segment, I'll be discussing various ideas and methods for troubleshooting network connectivity issues. Then I'll move into configuring Windows 95 as a server. When you're troubleshooting a network problem, it's important that you ask the right questions so that you get focused on what you need to fix. For example, if you're unable to connect to one particular machine on the network, you need to ask yourself, can you see any other machines on the network? Because then maybe that one particular machine is misconfigured if you are able to see other machines on the network. Also, you need to ask yourself which protocols you're using and whether or not you need to be using a routable protocol if you're trying to connect to a machine across a router, perhaps in another workgroup or another domain. And if you're unable to access resources to a particular machine, then you want to ask what security is in place. Is there a rights issue? Do you have rights to the resources on that machine? You may be able to see that machine, but you may need the rights to be able to access resources on the machine. If you're having trouble running network applications, you may want to ask yourself if you can run other network applications. In other words, is it just this one network application that's not working? Perhaps that application needs to be updated to the latest version. If you are unable to connect to machines, you may want to ask yourself if you were ever able to connect in the past. In other words, has anything changed since the last time you've connected, such as has any cables been removed or added? We're speaking specifically about hardware. Maybe a different net card was added, maybe a different router was put in place, or just maybe different cables, either twisted pair cables or coax cables, for example. One of the most common calls I recall when I was in support was using termination when you're using an Ethernet network. So make sure you check to see that there are terminators at the end of the two machines on the bus. Let me demonstrate for you what I'm referring to when you're using a net card that has a BNC connector. Here I've got the Intel Ether Express cards. These are actually the cards that shipped with Windows for Workgroups 3.1 starter kits. You notice we have a BNC connector at the end. A common problem that we've seen when Windows for Workgroups shipped with these cards is that many people had the two-person network where you have two workstations and you're trying to make the two machines speak to each other. Well, they thought, if I have two net cards, all I need to do is just connect my cable to one card and then the other end of the cable to the other card. Well, there's no termination built into the card. So the proper way to connect is to use a T connector and a terminator. The T connector also shipped in the box with the startup kit. Make sure you twist the end too. Here's your T connector. Then you can put your cable at the end of the T connector. And it's very important to put the terminator at the other end. And then you can do the same for the other card connected to the other end of the cable. Again, this is a very common call, and it's important that you have terminators at the end of your BNC connections. For troubleshooting, Windows 95 offers some great online help. If you're having trouble using the network, let's take a look at what Windows 95 online help can help you with. From the Start button, you can select Help, and you'll notice we have several books. One is on Introducing Windows, another is on the how to configure certain things, another is Tips and Tricks, but we're going to focus on troubleshooting. You'll notice there are several documents to help you troubleshoot different problems, such as printing, running out of memory, needing more disk space, and having a hardware conflict, for example. Let's focus on the networking. if you have trouble using the network. We'll click on that, and you'll see it brings up the context-sensitive help for the network troubleshooter. The screen tells us this troubleshooter will help you identify and solve problems with your computer's network. Just click to answer the questions and then try the suggested tips to fix the problem. Well, it gives you a choice of things that could be wrong. Let's just try the first one. I can't log on to the network. You'll notice then it asks you several other questions, such as, am I using the client from Microsoft Networks as opposed to different clients? Well, let's go ahead and select using the client from Microsoft Networks. The other options we get are if no domain server could validate my password, or if a duplicate computer name exists on the network. Let's go ahead and select no domain server could validate my password. Another great thing in Windows 95 Help is that we will have context-sensitive pointers that will bring you into the network properties. For example, you'll see here, when checking your network domain, you should click here to display the network properties. So I clicked at that button, and you notice we're back in the network configuration screen. Well, this is great. It tells me exactly what to do next. Click Client from Microsoft Network, and then click Properties. So I click Client from Microsoft Network, and here I click Properties. And then Step 3 tells me, make sure that Log On to Windows NT domain is checked, which in this case it is, and that the correct Windows NT domain is listed. If you do not know which domain is correct, contact your network administrator. So again, Windows 95 Help really is great for helping you go through step-by-step how to solve and troubleshoot your own problems. Another neat tool Windows 95 ships for helping you troubleshoot network problems is something called System Monitor. System Monitor tracks activity for your client, your server, and the IPX protocol. And let's get into the properties of the network neighborhood. Some additional ideas for troubleshooting would include confirming whether or not the client is validated by the domain. One way to check that is to highlight the client from Microsoft Networks, select Properties, make sure that we have enabled Log On to Windows NT domain, and that the NT domain name is correct. When the user logs on, they will probably see a message that confirms that they've been successfully validated by the domain. So you want to confirm that the client is validated so that they can access resources from the domain. Another good troubleshooting tip would be if you're having trouble connecting to servers, try troubleshooting servers in your local work group as opposed to trying to troubleshoot servers in another domain or another work group, especially if it's across a router. We also talked about earlier setting the default protocol and checking other protocol settings. That's important for applications, especially using that LANA 0 data structure we talked about. Setting the default protocol, for example, NetBEUI, Properties, Advanced, is as easy as checking the box that says, set this protocol to be the default protocol. Another thing you probably want to check when you're in this user interface is the bindings to the adapter, the protocol, and the client. Let's start with the adapter first. I'll check Properties, Bindings, and you'll notice we have checkboxes for all the protocols that this adapter is bound to. Make sure that there is a checkbox to the appropriate protocol you plan to use. When we check the protocol, for example, IPX-SPX, select Properties and Bindings, make sure that protocol is bound to the client and server you plan to use. And finally, the client. What you also want to do is confirm the adapter settings and make sure that they're correct and not conflicting with any other hardware. We saw that earlier with Device Manager, and you can also confirm the adapter settings from the Network Configuration utility. Again, selecting Properties, select Resources, and make sure that these settings are correct for interrupt and the I/O address range. You'll notice the number sign indicates a value is set to the current hardware setting. As opposed to the little X at the lower screen, you'll see this indicates a conflict with other hardware. For example, if I select the interrupt and I want to change it to 11 in this case, you'll notice the little sign is different. It's a small X, and that means it's in conflict with other hardware. I'll bring it back down to 10, which is what this card is set to. Anytime you're changing interrupts or any other configuration settings for hardware, make sure you turn off the machine and cold boot the PC when you're resetting hardware. That's very important when you're initializing hardware. A Control-Alt-Delete, or otherwise known as a soft boot or a warm boot, is not a good idea when you're resetting hardware settings. Another good troubleshooting tip when you're not able to connect to other servers in protected mode Windows is to try real mode. Let me go ahead and come over to this other Windows 95 machine, and we'll bring this down to real mode. We'll restart the computer in MS-DOS mode. And we can use some of the various net commands. Oh, stupid. So at real mode, we'll be using the Windows 95 net commands. For example, if I want to test to see if I can connect to a machine in real mode, all I would type is net use, and the trick I have is the asterisk accepts the next available drive letter, followed by a space, your double backslash, and then the server name, followed by the share name. And let's see if I can connect to this machine in real mode. It tells me I can connect successfully, and it actually designates the next available drive letter, which you can see is drive letter D. Now I'm going to reboot so I can show you step by step what takes place when all the network components load. When we're ready to start Windows 95, I'll press the F8 key so I can get the interactive menu. And I'm not going to load any network components, so I'll select Safe Mode Command Prompt Only. The first step you want to do when determining which components are failing is a net init, which stands for net initialize. Basically, net init loads the real mode netcard adapter and any real mode protocols into memory. The binding does not take place at this point. We're just merely loading drivers into memory. And if the netcard was misconfigured, we should get an error at this point. As you can see, the screen tells us that the 3COM DOS Etherlink 3 network card driver, version 2.0, has completed successfully. The next step would be to load the internal protocols, in other words, the protocols internal to the file net.exe. And those two protocols, if you recall, are NetBEUI and NWLink. I can install each of them separately with a net start command, NetBEUI, and it tells me the command has completed successfully, which means NetBEUI is in memory. One way to check to see if your components are in memory is to use the mem command with a /c option. My /p keeps it from scrolling off the page and keeps one page of data on the screen at a time. And as you can see on the screen, we have protman loaded, which is our protocol manager. We have the ELNK3, which is a netcard driver. NDIS help, of course, is the real mode component that keeps NetBUI flexible so it can be dynamically loaded and unloaded. And then the NetBUI protocol is also installed. Now I'll add the NWLink protocol, again using the netstart command. NWLink loaded successfully as well. Again, we can use the mem command to check it in memory. And you'll notice at the bottom, right after NetBUI, is NWLink. So again, we're checking in memory to make sure these components are loaded. And the final thing you want to load into memory is the redirector. Remember, the three components to every network operating system is your netcard driver, your protocol, and your redirector. In protected mode, we added a fourth component, which was the network provider, and that gave us the consistent UI. Let's go ahead and load the redirector. There's actually a few different ways or a few different commands you can use. You would always begin with a netstart, and you could use netstart reader or netstart basic. I'll go ahead and type netstart reader. And the redirector loads successfully as well. Again, we can check it in memory. And you'll see below NWLink, the entry for the redirector is actually called basic. And you'll see it's about 14K, which is also great news. In Windows 95, our redirector is only 14K of memory. So everything seemed to be loading fine. Well, let's go ahead and try another technique or another utility that ships in Windows 95 and actually was available in Windows for Workgroups as well. It's called NetDiag. NetDiag is a utility that actually sends packets from one machine to another, and it checks to see if the packets were sent correctly and successfully. NetDiag will test the transfer of packets using either the NetBUI or IPX protocol. More specifically, instead of NetBUI, it's really testing the NetBIOS portion of NetBUI. So the neat thing about NetDiag is any protocol running with NetBIOS will work. NetDiag tells me that both IPX and NetBIOS have been detected. That's because I have the NetBUI protocol running. And I should press I if I want to check for IPX diagnostics, or N if I want to use the NetBIOS diagnostics. I'll select I, and we'll test this out with IPX. Now what NetDiag is doing is searching the network for any other diagnostic servers. It tells me no diagnostic server was detected. Well, that's true because no other server has been running NetDiag. This is the first machine running NetDiag. So it tells us that since no servers were detected, this machine will act as a diagnostic server if we choose to. It says, is the Microsoft Network Diagnostics currently running on any other machines on the network? I'll say no. And then it says this machine will now begin acting as a diagnostic server. And we can press any key to stop this program. So now I'll come over to my main PC, and I'll have this machine interact with this other Windows 95 PC. I've been doing all of this NetDiag activity from real mode. However, you can run NetDiag from an MS-DOS virtual machine within Windows 95. So from the Start button, I'll select Programs and select my MS-DOS prompt. And here I'll type in NetDiag. And again, it detects that I'm running both the IPX protocol and the NetBIOS interface. I'll go ahead and select I because I want to match the same protocol that's running on this machine. And it tells me it was searching for a diagnostic server, and in fact, a diagnostic server has been located on the network. So it has found this machine. The next line of data tells us it was communicating with the diagnostic server, and it may take several seconds. It's validating replies from the diagnostic server, so what's happening is they're speaking to each other. This machine as a server is sending packets to this machine, and this client is sending replies back. It tells us that it indicates the network information is being sent and received properly, and the command was successfully completed. You'll notice that on the server side, it actually has a message that says it was sending replies to the workstation, so that you know the server was actually responding to this workstation. Again, NetDiag is a great utility to use when you're testing IPX transactions or transactions using the NetBIOS interface. So if your NetBIOS applications are not working, using NetDiag is probably a useful utility. Again, it can be run from real mode, and it can be run from an MS-DOS VM. Another thing to keep in mind, if you're not able to connect to a server, and you went through the 4 steps I showed you about net-init and loading the protocols and loading a NetStart reader, and you don't seem to get any errors, but you still can't access another server from real mode, you want to make sure that the computer name and the workgroup name for this particular machine is not already used by another computer name on the network. Remember, the computer name must be unique on the network for each workstation. Now that we have an understanding of how the client works, let's talk about the server services. I'll go ahead and exit out of my virtual machine in Windows 95. And to add the server services, the quickest way is to secondary mouse click on the network neighborhood, select Properties, brings us up to our configuration screen. I can select Add, Service. You'll notice actually we have several different vendors listed for the server service. The Arcadia and Cheyenne are both for the backup agents. We'll be talking about backup agents in the system management program later in this series. Let's focus on the Microsoft server services. You notice that Windows 95 ships protected mode components for server services. One is file and printer sharing for Microsoft networks, and the other is file and printer sharing for NetWare networks. Yes, in fact, this is a protected mode NCP server. In other words, network clients can connect to this Windows 95 machine as an NCP server. And Joseph Davies will be talking to you in much more detail about the NetWare components and Windows 95 in the NetWare environment in our next program. Let's get back to the Microsoft Networks server. And you'll notice the user interface says File and Printer Sharing for Microsoft Networks. Well, that's kind of long for me to say throughout the rest of this program, so I'm just going to call it the server. So anytime I say server, I'm actually referring to the File and Printer Sharing for Microsoft Networks. The server for Microsoft Networks is the SMB server message block server, which allows you to talk to other Windows 95 or Windows for Workgroups or Windows NT machines, as well as LAN manager machines. One thing to note is that the server for Microsoft Networks requires that the client, the same SMB client for Microsoft Networks, to also be installed. Let me show you what I mean. If I remove the client for Microsoft Networks, let me go ahead and add the server under Service, select Microsoft, and then I select File and Printer Sharing for Microsoft Networks. I'll select OK. You'll notice not only did it add the server, but it also added the client automatically. That's something to keep in mind, that the client must also be running if you want the server service installed. Similarly, if you wanted to install the server for NetWare, you would need the network client as well. The good news is you can have multiple clients installed. But one thing to keep in mind, in Windows 95, you can only have one server installed. Again, you can have multiple clients installed, but only one server. So if I wanted to add the NetWare server, Microsoft's protected mode NetWare server, it would tell me the file and printer sharing for NetWare networks cannot be installed together with the file and printer sharing from Microsoft Networks. So at least the user interface comes up and tells you why you cannot install a second server. Again, the following clients can connect to the Windows 95 server for Microsoft Networks. Of course, another Windows 95 client for Microsoft Networks, a Windows for Workgroups client, a Windows NT workstation and server, LAN Manager clients, and other LAN Manager variants such as DEC PathWorks, and of course, the Workgroup add-on for Microsoft DOS. The server component maintains the browse server list if that server is elected to participate in the browsing scheme. Remember, browsing was what gave us a list of all the servers in our network neighborhood. One thing to keep in mind is that if you have a workstation that also is in only one work group, in other words, this workstation is the only workstation in the work group, and no other workstations are part of this work group, if you want to be able to browse other servers on the network, you must have the server service installed. In other words, every workgroup must have at least one server so that it can maintain the browse list so you can browse servers in other workgroups. Let's go ahead and take a look at the properties for the Microsoft server. I've got file and printer sharing highlighted. I'll select Properties. And you'll notice we have two properties, one for Browse Master and one for LM Announce. The Browse Master, again, by default is set to automatic. If we wanted to disable Browse Mastering, we can select Disable, but keep in mind if everybody selects Disable in your workgroup, nobody will be able to browse. Or if you wanted the machine dedicated to be a Browse Master or a backup browser all the time, you could force it by selecting Enable. Again, the default is automatic, and that means it will participate in election. The other property for the file server is LM Announce. This is for LAN Manager workstations that are also part of your network environment. If a LAN Manager workstation wants to be able to browse this Windows 95 server in its browse list, we need to be able to select this to Yes. By default, it's selected to No, which reduces network traffic. And the assumption is you may not have LAN Manager workstations in your network environment because you've probably all upgraded them by now. But if you happen to have any LAN Manager workstations in the environment, you should select LAN Man Announce to Yes. Again, this is just for browsing. A LAN Man workstation can still connect to the Windows 95 server by typing in the Universal Naming Convention name string. In other words, your //server name /SharePoint. Windows 95 supports user-level security in addition to share-level security. Let's take a look at the access control page, and you'll notice by default we have share-level access set. This enables you to supply a password for each shared resource. Again, share level is the default in the Windows 95 machine, and as a matter of fact, Windows for Workgroups only provided share level security. On the other hand, Windows NT machines only provide user level security. Windows 95 gives you the best of both worlds and allows you to share directories and printers with either share level or user level security. One thing to keep in mind is with user level security in Windows 95, it's a little bit different than Windows NT. Windows NT actually gives you the option to share specific files in a directory. In Windows 95, you have to share the entire directory. We do not share specific files. Let me go ahead and demonstrate for you the share level security option. It asked me if I wanted to restart because I thought I made a change, but I actually didn't make any changes with share level. I'll go into the Explorer, which I just happen to have a shortcut on my desktop for. And I'm going to go ahead and highlight a directory with my secondary mouse click. And because the server services are installed, I have the option of sharing on my context menu. I'll select shared, and of course it's not shared by default. I can go ahead and select share as. The share name defaults to what the directory name was. I could enter a comment. And by default, this is something important to keep in mind. The default for share level security is read only. So if you wanted to give full share security, full access, you need to select full. If you wanted to, you could insert a password, or if you wanted to have the option of users with certain passwords connecting as read-only and users with a different password connecting as full access, you have that option as well. Selecting depends on password. You can enter a read-only password for the read-only and a full password for full. I select OK, and it tells me to please re-enter the passwords since I'm requiring a password from a user, just so we can confirm that that password I entered is in fact the one I want to use. And I'll re-enter those passwords. And you'll notice there's a little hand underneath the directory I shared. Another interesting thing to keep in mind is if I wanted to make this share hidden, I could have as the last character a $sign. For example, when I secondary mouse click the directory, select sharing, under the share name, I could make the last character a $sign. This means it'll be hidden from other machines when they're browsing. So I'll select OK. We'll now go to the other Windows 95 machine and see how this machine responds to the shares that are shared on this Windows 95 machine. Of course, the quickest way to access my network resources is to go into the network neighborhood. And I'll highlight the main PC, which is this Windows 95 machine. And it shows me, in addition to an Apple printer being shared, the M8 and Scenes directories. Well, yes, I do have those two directories shared, but you probably recall that I also had another directory shared with a $sign. Well, it's not visible to me in a browsing kind of format, but if I knew the exact name of that share, I could type it in and connect to it. So from the toolbar, I'm going to select Map Network Drive and enter in the name of the PC, which is main_PC, and that share name was Dell Goody $sign. Again, the $sign made this share hidden. I select OK. It asks me for a password because remember I password protected it. And if I wanted read-only access, I can type in the read-only password. Or if I wanted full access, I can type in the full password. I'll just type in the read-only. And you'll see that it actually gives me access to the files on that directory. It tells me that I'm connected to the Dell Goody $sign on my main PC, which is in fact mapped to drive E, and it will give me all the files in that directory. So the $sign is kind of a good trick to know if you're trying to hide shares from people just kind of surfing around on the network. That's basically share level security. Let's go ahead and move on and talk about user level security. User level security requires one valid security provider to pass through the validation for access. What I'm referring to is a machine that actually holds the security database of all the users and groups you're trying to give access to. So for example, when a client workstation is trying to access a Windows 95 server running user level security, it needs to pass through that validation to a security provider such as a Windows NT machine. The Windows 95 machine will check the credentials of the client, pass that information to, for example, the Windows NT server. The Windows NT server will either validate or deny access, pass that information back to the Windows 95 server, and then the server will grant access to the client. Let's go ahead and see how we can configure this machine to have user-level security. Again, the easiest way is to select Properties from the Network neighborhood, select My Access Control page, and here I'll select User-Level Access Control. This enables you to specify users and groups who have access to each shared resource. It's important that we enter the correct name for the security provider. Here we say we're obtaining a list of users and groups from Traincast. Traincast is actually the domain name of this Windows NT server. When I select OK, it will ask me to reboot, but first it also has noticed that I've had my directories and printers shared using share level security. So this message tells me, because your access control configuration has changed from share level to user level security, it says any directories you have shared will no longer be shared. You can reshare them after restarting your computer. Do you want to continue? And for this demonstration, I'll say yes. And then it'll ask me to restart the computer. It tells me one user is connected to my network, which was this Windows 95 machine here, and it lets me know that shutting down my computer will disconnect this client. And yes, I will continue. After rebooting and getting all the user level configuration in place, let's go ahead and share some directories with the user level security option enabled. I'll go into Explorer, and let's go ahead and share that directory again. Because the server service is enabled, sharing is on. And you'll notice the user interface looks different than it did with share level security. Again, of course, by default, we are not shared. And when I want to share as, again, the share name defaults to the directory name. I could put in a comment, and you'll notice below are names of users and groups that exist on my security provider. For the SMB server, the server message block server, remember that's the protocol that we use to connect to Microsoft networks, valid security providers are the Windows NT workstation, a Windows NT domain. A NetWare server can only be a valid security provider for the NCP servers, the servers for NetWare networks. Again, we'll talk about the NetWare environment in our later program. So again, if I'm running the Microsoft server, my valid security providers are not only the Windows NT domain, but you can have a Windows NT workstation as well. And that Windows NT machine has the security database that brings up all of these users and groups on my screen. You'll notice that I have administrators, a guest, the world, of course, is available, user 1, 2, 3, and 4. In this particular case, this directory has already been shared out with these particular access rights. Let me go ahead and share out a new directory so we can see how we can do this from the beginning. Oh, let's go ahead and share the scenes directory. And you'll see that even when we select share as, again the share name is scenes, the name of the directory, we have no names in my list. When I select add, here is where I get the list of users available from my security provider. It's important to know that the Windows 95 server machine uses an existing security database. the security provider, such as the Windows NT machine, must have all the users and groups you want to give access to. So you cannot add new users on the Windows 95 machine if they do not already exist on the Windows NT machine. The pass-through security model in Windows 95 does support users from trusted domains. Trusted domains allow their user and group accounts to be available to other domains. Trusted domains is a Windows NT concept, and if you need to know more about trusted domains, you can probably read about it in your Windows NT documents. This special relationship between trusted domains must be set up by the Windows NT administrator. The Windows 95 machine just keeps the rights for each of the resources to each of the users. This information is also known as the Access Control List, also known as ACL. Let me go ahead and start giving rights to some of these users. For example, for user 1, I'll give that user full access, and user 2, I'll also give full access. And the guests, we'll give them read-only access, and the domain users, we'll give them custom access. And I'll go into custom access and all of those rights in a few minutes. But when I click OK, because I have a user in custom access, it will automatically prompt me for which custom access rights to view. Well, I'll go ahead and give them create rights, delete rights, and read rights. And I'll select OK. And you'll notice now these are all the users that have access to this scenes directory. I'll select OK. And of course, the little hand appears underneath the scenes directory so that we know it's shared. Let me show you where in the registry some of this information is kept. Again, I just brought up regedit, which is our registry editing tool. And let's go into HKey local machine, security, access. And from my C drive, you'll notice that I have these directories shared, and specifically the scenes directory shows me my domain users, guest, user 1, and user 2. So this is where in the registry we keep the ACL, that access control list. Again, the security database is not on the Windows 95 machine. It must be on your valid security provider like the Windows NT, but only the access control list of rights for those existing users exist on the Windows 95 machine. The following access rights are used in Windows 95 user-level security. We have read files, write to files, create files and folders, delete files, change file attributes, list files, and change access control. Let's talk about permissions for a minute. Permissions flow differently in Windows 95 than they do in Windows NT. User rights take precedence over group rights in Windows 95. And rights on a parent directory flow downward implicitly to the subdirectories. Rights on the subdirectories can be explicitly changed from the rights assigned to the parent directory. Let's go ahead and take a look at an illustration. You'll see that the C drive is set to read only. So everything below the C drive would implicitly have read-only access, such as the central directory, the East Coast directory, and the W_Coast directories. However, what we've done here is explicitly set the W_Coast directory to full access. What that means is that that W_Coast directory has full access even though the directories above it, like eCoast and Central, have read-only access. In addition, that West Coast directory set to full also has its subdirectories set to full implicitly, such as the brochure directory and the contract directory. But just for an added twist, we've also added in this illustration the contract directory set to custom rights. In this particular example, we see RLD, which would tell you we have read-only, list, and delete rights. And then, of course, those custom permissions flow down the directory tree from the contract directory. So 1992, 1993, and 1994 all have the same custom rights as the contract directory does. For a user to get access to a Windows 95 resource with user-level security, there's a couple of things you need to keep in mind. The username must exist on the security provider, again the Windows NT machine, or the guest account must be enabled. The other thing you need to keep in mind is the user must be granted access on the Windows 95 machine, or again, if the guest account is enabled on the security provider, the guest account must be enabled on the Windows 95 machine as well. Let's take a look at a decision flow chart to determine when a user will be granted access. In this example, we see the valid username. In other words, a client passes credentials to the Windows 95 server, and it passes a valid username, but the password is invalid. In that case, the user will be prompted with a message that asks them to type in a valid password. We'll go through the loop again, passing the credentials to the Windows 95 server. The Windows 95 server passes those credentials to the security provider. The credentials I'm referring to are the username, the password, and the domain name. The security provider will basically either grant access or deny access. If they grant access because it is a valid username, then the client username is checked on the Windows 95 ACL. Remember, ACL stood for the Access Control List. If the username is not in the Windows 95 ACL, then access will be denied. If the username is on the Windows 95 ACL, then the client will be granted access to the resource on the Windows 95 server. In the next example, we see when a user passes an invalid username. So the client passes these credentials to the Windows 95 server, and the Windows 95 server passes those credentials to the security provider. Because the username is invalid, it would not be on the security provider's database. But if the guest account is enabled on the security provider, then we will pass back to the Windows 95 machine, and the Windows 95 machine will check to see if the guest account is also on the ACL. If the guest account is on the ACL, then the client will be granted guest access. If the guest account is not on the Windows 95 ACL, that client will be denied access. Well, let's get back to Elliot so I can answer some more of your questions. After the Q&A break, I'll cover some tips for resolving user-level security issues. Then we'll discuss network printing and a few network utilities.
Autumn, one of the questions that I get asked most often by folks sending me electronic mail is, can I configure my Windows 95 machine to act as a server to both Microsoft Network clients and Novell Network clients?
I can see that being a common question, Elliot. Since Windows 95 provides protected mode support for both the Microsoft Network server and the Novell Network server, it's an interesting question to see if we can have them both installed at the same time. Well, let's take a look at the PC and see what we've got installed and see what we can do. As you see here, what I've got highlighted is the file and printer sharing for Microsoft Networks. So this is my SMB server. Notice, of course, the client has to be installed, client for Microsoft Nets. What we're going to do here is see if we can add the protected mode network server. So I'll select Add, select Service, and here is where I'm going to try to add the networks. It tells me that the file and printer sharing for networks cannot be installed together with the file and printer sharing for Microsoft Networks. So the answer is no, you cannot have them both installed at the same time. But if I did want to install the networks, what I would need to do is remove the file and printer sharing for Microsoft Networks, and then go ahead and add the networks server And here it is, file and printer sharing for network networks. Notice, if you recall from the presentation I just did, that you'll have to have the client installed for that same SMB type of protocol as well. And another thing to keep in mind is if you're changing between the two servers, when I go into my access control tab, you'll notice that if we're installing the NetWare file server, user level access control is the only thing that's available to us. Share level access control is grayed out. So if you are going to install NetWare, make sure that you plan to use the user level security.
Thank you very much, Autumn. It seems to me that we're starting to move to the era of sort of point and configure and click and configure. The Windows 95 engineers have been very busy and sent us some more viewer questions. However, before we get to those questions, yes, that's right, it's the contest time again. Now, I want you to think about this because this is an easy question. I want you to name one of the network protocols supported by Windows 95. As you know, 100 names will be drawn from the correct answers to receive a copy of Microsoft Encarta. And remember, everyone that calls will have their name entered into the grand prize drawing for a chance to win a new multimedia computer system provided by the Dell Corporation. So here's an 800 number to call, 800-254-4069, to answer the question for your chance to win. Okay, and for those of you that would like just a little bit of a hint, if you ever watch The Village People, you know, okay, won't tell you what the third letter is, but cool, I really want you to win that software. Well, here are Frank and Autumn again, and we've had quite a few calls that have come in over the last hour. Autumn, I'm going to put you right back on the spot. Jim called from the 814 area code, and Jim actually had a two-part question, so we'll take it one. The first question that Jim has was, does Windows 95 have RNA, and is there any added functionality over Workgroup for Windows 3.11 RAS?
Okay, RNA, I assume he's referring to remote network access. As a matter of fact, Windows 95 has fantastic support for what we're now calling dial-up networking. And as a matter of fact, all he needs to do is just go into the My Computer icon, select dial-up networking, and we actually have a wizard, which is a step-by-step installation process that can take him through installing the components so that he can be a dial-up networking client. And we have quite a bit of enhancements from Windows for Workgroups RAS, as some people may have used in the past. The dial-up networking client that we have in Windows 95 supports connectivity to PPP and SLIP servers, which are very popular on the internet, as well as connecting to the Novell NetWare Connect protocol, proprietary protocol.
Yeah, I'm actually using that. I'm using the dial-up network connection to, our whole domain has a PPP slip connection, and it's real powerful. Well, Jim's second question, Autumn, was, does Windows 95 have, and this he clearly wants to go surfing, does he have an FTP server software built into that?
Okay, Windows 95 does not come with FTP server software out of the box.
Right.
We can connect as a client to FTP servers on the internet. But if you are surfing the internet, you can probably find some pretty good shareware or freeware software to get an FTP server, and it will work on Windows 95.
So, just
to
clarify, so if I want to surf, I'm surfing enabled.
That's right.
But if I want to be producing waves, I want to be like a surf producer, that's not there.
Well, it's not there in the box, but we will support third-party utilities.
Okay, excellent. Well, Frank, we had another one of our live callers call in, and our support engineers suggested that we bring him live with us. So we're going to shoot down to Fort Valley, Georgia, and say hi to Ed. Are you there, Ed?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Ed. Frank's ready and waiting for your question.
Hi, Ed.
I support a bunch of classroom teachers and other educational users, and one of the problems we've had with Windows in the past is it's such a malleable environment. That's great, but it becomes a liability in a classroom situation where the actions of one class change the look and feel so drastically that we have a large startup time getting the next group of students in. What tools are we going to have available, and how do we get that information out to teachers that are using Windows in a classroom environment?
Thanks a lot. And in other words, how do we stabilize the environment and sort of almost learner-proof it at times?
Well, I think the process would probably be is you have to like first enable your user profiles, and then once you've done that, you can do things like use the system policy editor, which we'll provide. And once with system policy editor, you actually can go in and you can actually tweak the profile in such a way that a lot of those components that might be in the operating system that might cause some instability that you're seeing right now can be taken out. So the end user experience in that case would first, they'd come in and they'd log on, and you would have to have the right logon. Once they've logged on, a profile set for that name so that those elements within the operating system that you are encountering instability with at the present time would just be removed, and they wouldn't have any option to be able to, create that instability that you're speaking of.
Would it be fair to say that, in fact, one of the values and the wins for this product is the ability to control the environment and to stabilize the environment?
I think definitely from the systems management point of view. I mean, using System Policy Editor, the end user truly would not even see those options available to them. So.
Right. So you can slim it down.
You can slim it pretty skinny.
Windows 95 Lite for them.
Yeah, it's very light.
Does Windows 95 use the same security model as Windows NT? Jill from Columbus called us a few minutes ago.
Well, the security model for Windows 95 is essentially its extension of the server that you're running off of. So with a pass-through security model of a Windows 95, if you're running on, let's say, an NT server, you're using the NT model. If you're using a NetWare server, you're using the NetWare model. This is what we refer to as pass-through security.
I see.
So, but Windows 95 proper, if it was acting as a server, it's really constrained to being a workgroup model.
In our remaining time, let's just take a couple moments to talk about Microsoft Network.
Okay.
It's gotten a lot of press, and people are real excited about this thing. How does one actually access MSN?
Well, right now, if you're a member of our World Preview program, you could access MSN directly, and actually it's free of charge up until the launch period. And actually I have a phone number for you out there if you'd like to be able to access it. And that's going to be 1-800-95-PREVIEW. And the extra few characters on the preview, I mean, they're not really recognized, so you don't have to worry about that. But 1-800-95-PREVIEW, you can actually register to become a WPP participant, and then you can actually access MSN online.
And there's some real cool stuff on MSN. I just played with Bookshelf online the other day, and that was wild to feel like you were operating sort of a CD-ROM, but it's actually coming through the phone line. So, well, that's all the time that we have right now. But remember, we're going to be taking your questions throughout the broadcast, and the Microsoft engineers are standing by. Another phone number for you, 206-635-7066. It's time now for the fourth and final segment of the show. Autumn, be on your way back to the demo area, and she's going to be covering network printing and applications. I'm personally anxious to hear the details of the new point-and-print feature. This is really important information. Autumn, let me ask you another quick question. Can I print from MS-DOS-based applications using a UNC connection to a network printer?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question. There's a lot of MS-DOS applications still out there that people are going to be using with Windows 95. As a matter of fact, if you're going to use an MS-DOS application to print from, you've got to make sure that you redirect the port. So in other words, my printer has to be redirected to a particular port. We can't just rely on the UNC resource name.
Okay, well, thank you very much there. Autumn, we're back over to you now.
In this section, we'll be focusing on network printing, network applications, and we'll summarize the entire program. But I promised to review some troubleshooting tips for user-level security issues, so let's go ahead and start with that now. There are two issues to keep in mind when troubleshooting a server that is set for user-level security. The first thing you need to understand is there is a network connection that needs to be resolved. In other words, you have two machines that you need to make sure they are configured properly so that hardware-wise they're able to see each other. The second step to solve user-level security issues, once you confirmed that the two machines can see each other, is to go into the user account rights and make sure that that user in fact has the appropriate rights. A few questions you want to ask yourself are, can the user who is trying to access the Windows 95 server actually access the machine? In other words, can they even see the machine on the network? That is before you start trying to troubleshoot whether or not they have the appropriate rights for the resource. The second thing you want to find out is, can the Windows 95 server actually access the security provider, such as the Windows NT machine? because otherwise the pass-through security model would be broken if the Windows 95 server could not access the security provider. The other thing you need to make sure is that if the client is trying to access a resource on the Windows 95 machine, you need to make sure that that client user account actually exists on the Windows NT security provider. One test is to see if the client can actually access the security provider. Keep in mind when you're doing that test that they're both going to have to be running the same protocols and there could be routing issues to be aware of. Another great troubleshooting tip to try when you're troubleshooting user level security is what happens if the Windows 95 server adds the world to its access control list. In other words, if a particular user is having trouble accessing a resource, it's a good idea to add the world, in other words, everyone, all users, to the access control list and see if that makes a difference. If it does make a difference, then that probably means that that particular user doesn't have rights on the security provider. Let's go ahead and move on to network printing. Network printing is a common call for product support services. Users may not know the type of the printer or the model of a particular network printer or where the drivers are located. All they want to do is print to the printer. Well, Windows 95 has provided some great solutions to make installing and connecting to network printers easier. The Windows 95 Point and Print feature allows you to install the driver for a printer over the network automatically, just by dragging the network printer icon from the network neighborhood to either the local machine's printer folder or on the desktop. Let me show you how that's done. Here I am in the network neighborhood, and let me connect to a machine that has some printers shared. I've just selected my other Windows 95 machine, and I see I have a digital printer shared. It's as easy as dragging the digital printer onto my desktop and creating the shortcut. Here's my network resource printer. There's actually another way to do this. I could make my printers folder available, and going back into the network neighborhood, let's look at the NT server that happens to be sharing an Apple printer. I can actually drag that Apple printer into my printers folder and select install. I'll actually go through the installation of printing in a few minutes, so I'll just select cancel now. You can also just drag a document into the network printer icon. Here I have a shortcut to the readme.txt, and I'll just drag that into my printer icon. It'll ask me if I want to print. Because I haven't officially installed the drivers for this printer yet, I'll select cancel, and we'll go ahead and do the print function in a few moments. In either case, Windows 95 determines the printer name and automatically loads the driver across the network to the local drive. Windows 95 supports point and print with printers managed by Windows 95 machine, or a Windows NT machine, or even a Novell NetWare server. So when connecting to these printers, the user only has to answer a couple of simple dialogues. And we'll go through those dialogues now. Again, here's my printer that was shared on a Windows 95 machine acting as a point and print server. I will now try to print my document. It tells me before you can use the printer, which is shared on the Windows 95 PC, it must be set up on your computer. Do you want Windows to set up the printer and then print your document? And I'll say yes. And now we're going to go through the installation process. You'll notice we're starting with an Add Printer Wizard. I'll actually run through all the steps of this Add Printer Wizard in a few moments when we share a printer on this Windows 95 server. But now I just want to show you how easy it is to print to a remote network printer. The only questions I will be asked are, do you want to print from an MS-DOS-based program? And I'll say no. And then it asks me to type in the name for the printer that I can use. Basically, this is a friendly name. It doesn't have to be any particular model name or driver name. This is just something that is meaningful to you. So I could call it the digital printer on the 4th floor. It'll ask me, do you want your Windows-based programs to use this printer as the default printer? I'll say no. And then the great thing in Windows 95 is it'll ask you if you want to print a test page. Well, that's great because right here you can print the test page and it actually gives you some details about the printer driver and some other support for that printer. I'll say no right now and finish. And as you can notice, the drivers are automatically found from the server and installed to my local machine. Now it's asking me, the program requires you to print documents with the default printer. Do I want this printer to become my default? If I say no, it will not be printed, I'll say yes. And what it's doing is it's opening the file and printing. But it asked me to supply a password because this printer was actually share protected on this server, so I'll type in my password. Notice also I have a printer icon on my taskbar. This alerts me that I have one document pending for user 3, which is what I was logged on this machine. If I wanted to get some information about my print job, I could double-click that icon, and you'll see I'll get the queue for this digital printer on the 4th floor. And here's my file, readme text. The status is it's currently printing. You notice the owner name is user 3. It's giving me a progress of the size, still planning to print, and it gives me a time and date. As I mentioned earlier, Windows 95 supports the point and print feature with printers managed by the Windows 95 machine, a Windows NT machine, and even a Novell NetWare machine. I'll go ahead and demonstrate for you the Add New Printer wizard so that we can add a printer and share it on the network. One of the ways to jump into the Add New Printer wizard is from the Start menu, select Settings and Printers. You'll notice I have several printers already attached to this machine, but by default we have an Add Printer icon. Let's go ahead and select that Add Printer icon. And this brings me to the first page of the Add Printer wizard. As you see in the screen, it tells us this wizard will help you install your printer quickly and easily. To begin installing your printer, click Next. The next question it asks us is whether or not this printer is a local or network printer. So if I wanted to install a network printer, I could right here if I didn't want to do the drag and drop that I did earlier from the network neighborhood. But I'll go ahead and install this as a local printer because remember, when you're serving out resources and sharing them from your Windows 95 machine, like any other network operating system, you can only share local resources. So let's go ahead and select the local printer. We select Next, and then we have options of what model we're going to install. Let's go ahead and stick with the Apple LaserWriter, and I'll select Next. This part gets confusing for some users, and again, with the point and print feature, users do not have to go through this screen if they're connecting to a network server that supports the point and print feature, such like the Windows 95 machine and the Windows NT machine, for example. It tells me that I've already got an Apple LaserWriter installed. It's asking me whether or not I want to keep the existing driver, which of course is recommended, or replace the existing driver. I'll go ahead and keep the existing driver. And then it asks me which port this printer is physically connected to. It defaults to the LPT port. You'll notice it also says ECP printer port. This is part of the plug-and-play specification. ECP is your enhanced capabilities port. Then it asks me for a name of the printer. It defaults to the model name, but I could also make this a friendly name that's more meaningful to me. such as Apple on the first floor. And then again it asks me if I want this to be the default printer. I'll go ahead and select yes and next. And then the last page asks me whether or not I would like to print a test page. Again, this is recommended. When you're installing and setting up your new printer, it's a good idea to run the test page to determine right then and there if it's working properly. I'm going to go ahead and say yes to print a test page so I can take you through the steps of what would happen if it did not print properly. I just clicked yes, and it's now copying the files. And soon it'll ask me whether or not the print test page was printed successfully. Here's the screen where it tells me the printer test page is completed. It asks me whether or not the test page printed correctly. If I say no, it immediately spawns the Help menu. You'll notice Windows Help is on the right side of the screen, and it asks me, am I printing to a local or network printer? And here we can go through the steps of troubleshooting printing problems right off the bat, which makes it easier for users. Here I'll select local, and then it gives me some steps to try. And again, it also is context-sensitive help, where if I click icons, it'll bring me to a new screen, just as it did with the network help we saw earlier. You'll also notice that this Apple on the first floor is now part of my printers folder. If I wanted to share this printer, all I need to do is click on my secondary mouse button, and you'll notice the sharing option is available. And then I can share as, and because I have user level security enabled, I would select add, and just like any other resource, we would have the list of users and groups coming from the security provider, which is our Windows NT machine. And for example, I can give the world full access. It was telling me that I have an error writing to LPT1 because I actually do not have the printer installed on this machine. And it asks me whether or not I do want to retry. And I'll say cancel. Merely serving out the printer on a Windows 95 machine automatically makes it a point-and-print server. Again, meaning that the user doesn't have to answer all those questions we just went through on the wizard. Just the two questions about the MS-DOS printing and what the friendly name is. With a Windows NT machine, the point and print feature is available, but only when the printer driver and the INF file is the same as the one that Windows 95 uses. Otherwise, the user will be asked the printer model and the location of the printer drivers to install from. When connecting to a remote printer, Windows 95 does not need to redirect a port to the network server location. All you need to do is just use the UNC name to access the printer resource or drag the printer into the printer folder or onto the desktop. So as you notice, the shortcut that I had created on the desktop does not have a printer port assigned to it. In other words, I don't have to take up an LPT or a COM port to designate this network printer. If I wanted to assign a printer port or capture the printer port, I can secondary mouse click, and you'll notice I have an option to capture printer port. And this is where the next available port it shows up on the screen. Here we have LPT1. Of course, the path is already decided. The Win95 PC is this machine that's sharing the printer, and it's a digital printer. You'll notice I have options for all these LPT ports, but I'll go ahead and keep it as LPT1. So we do have the option to capture the printer port if an application required a port designation. Checking the print queue is easy with Windows 95. Just click the printer icon either on the taskbar, as I showed you earlier, or open the printer from the Printers folder. I can just click on this printer icon, and here is the queue, again, where we have information on document name, status, the owner of the print job, and the size of the print job progress, as well as the time and date it was started. Another great thing about Windows 95 is we support something called deferred printing. On the laptop, if I wasn't connected to the network, but yet I wanted to print some documents, they would all stay in the spools folder. And then when I was connected to the network at a later time, all those print jobs would automatically print by asking me, we've got a bunch of print jobs in your spool folder, are you interested in printing them now? So deferred printing is another feature for mobile computing, which we'll talk about in a later program. Third-party vendors can take advantage of Windows 95 integrated networking. Both Hewlett-Packard and Digital Equipment Corporation have printers which use a network card inside the printer as if they were a node on the network. So this is a great thing. You've got a printer that's got a network card, it's attached to the network cabling, but you don't need another server or another workstation to actually spool those jobs. The Windows 95 Resource Kit includes support for both of these print servers. Windows 95 provides several options to administrate the HP JetAdmin printers using the IPX-SPX protocol. Windows 95 supports the DEC print servers, their software using TCP/IP protocol. Well, that wraps up the network printing. Let's talk about some of the network applications which may ship out of the Windows 95 box or with the Resource Kit. 3 network applications I'll talk about are WinPop-Up, NetWatcher, and the PWL editor. I've got my Start button programs configured so that under Network I can select any one of these programs. Let's talk about WinPop-Up. WinPop-Up uses a service called mail slots when it sends out broadcasts onto the network. It allows you to send and receive messages and alerts to or from LAN manager machines, Windows NT machines, and Windows for Workgroups 311 machines. WinPop-Up will also alert you when your print job is done. Let me go ahead and demonstrate for you how easy it is to use WinPop-Up to send broadcasts to other machines. You can either use the toolbar button to send messages, or from the menu, select Send, and you can type in either a username or a computer name or broadcast something to an entire work group. I'll send something to the laptop. I'll type in the laptop computer name, and there's my message, and I'll click OK. It's looking for the laptop on the network, tells me the message was sent successfully, and in fact, when we go to the laptop, we'll see on the taskbar the WinPop-Up icon, and it tells me I have one message waiting. When I click on that icon, I receive the message from user 3, so it gives me the username that sent the message, and it tells me the time and date the message was sent. I could save the message or delete it and throw it into wastebasket. And it automatically brings WinPop-Up back down to the taskbar. If I want to close WinPop-Up, keep in mind that it tells you when you close WinPop-Up, you will not receive any pop-up messages. So if you do want to continue receiving pop-up messages, you should minimize WinPop-Up. Let's go ahead and move on to the NetWatcher utility, which allows you to view which workstations are connected to your shared resources on the server. From the Start button, Programs, I have my network group configured to use the NetWatcher utility. There's NetWatcher, and when I maximize it, you can see that user 1, which is the Win95 PC, is currently attached to the Dell Goodies directory. User 4, the WFW PC, is connected to the Scenes directory. If I wanted to remove this user from that Scenes directory, in other words, I wanted to disconnect them, I could select this button from the toolbar, Disconnect User, or I can also do this from the menu. It asks me if I'm sure I want to disconnect the WFW PC from the main PC, which is this machine, and it also reminds me that any open files or running applications on that Windows for Workgroups machine may lose data if I disconnect them without them knowing. Well, I know there's no applications running, so I'm going to go ahead and disconnect that machine. And you'll notice it's removed from NetWatcher. Let's talk about PWL Editor. This is a great tool which allows you to remove passwords by connection instead of deleting the entire PWL file. If you recall, in Windows for Workgroups, you have a bunch of PWL files for each user that logs on to the machine. So every user has a PWL file. For each user, when they make a connection to various resources on the network, they may have to type in a password for each of those resources. Well, if you ever had problems trying to connect to a resource and you suspected it was a password problem, usually what you had to do was delete the entire PWL file, and that would force you to re-enter all passwords for all the other resources which you may not have had any problems connecting to. Well, let's take a look at how PWL Editor works. Again, for my Programs Network group, I've included the PWL Edit program, and this gives me a list of shares from the various resources I've connected to today. So I've connected on the Windows for Workgroups machine, on the C drive, and I've also connected to various resources on my Windows 95 machine. Let's say I had a problem connecting to the C drive on this Windows 95 machine. All I need to do is remove that one connection, and all my other passwords that are cached for each one of these resources are saved. So the PWL Editor is a great tool to try to troubleshoot password issues when connecting to resources. Let's summarize what we've learned in these 4 sections. We've started with how easy it is to browse network resources from the network neighborhood and from the Start button. And you no longer need to map a drive to a shared resource with Windows 95. Also, any server or shared resource object can be placed as a shortcut on the desktop for easy access. We talked about the Windows 95 plug-and-play protected mode network architecture. Out of the box, Windows 95 provides protected mode clients and servers for access to Microsoft and Novell networks. Soon we'll see protected mode components from third-party vendors to plug right into the Windows 95 network architecture. Windows 95 can be configured to use multiple protected mode clients and act as a universal client to many third-party networks. Administrators can lock out users from using Windows and/or the network by requiring validation from a Windows NT or a LAN manager domain controller. Running logon scripts from these domain controllers are also supported. Windows 95 provides protected mode support for the IPX, TCP/IP, and NetBEUI protocols. You recall NetBEUI is great for smaller workgroups. If you need routing services, you would use the IPX or TCP/IP protocols. And for access to the Internet, you'll use TCP/IP. Windows 95 supports Endus 3.1 plug-and-play netcard drivers, which ship right out of the box in Windows 95. Windows 95 also supports Windows NT mini-port drivers and the real mode Endus 2.0 and ODI compliant drivers. The protected mode server can be configured for share level or user level security. User level security requires one security provider, which can be either a Windows NT workstation or a Windows NT server. In the network printing section, we talked about point and print, the HP and DEC network support printers. And the cool thing about Point and Print is users can easily install a remote printer without needing to know any details about that printer. And finally, I demonstrated a few of the simple network tools to help out with real network tasks. Win Pop-Up can send out message alerts to computer names, users, and workgroups. NetWatcher allows you to view all users connected to your shared resources and gives you the option to disconnect them. PWL Editor makes it easy to resolve invalid password issues to network connections. Well, thanks very much. We covered a lot today, and I hope I answered most of your questions. Be sure to join us on the next edition of Windows 95 Traincast, when my buddy Joe Davies presents Windows 95 networking within the NetWare environment.
Thanks, Autumn. Why don't you come on over and join Frank and I at the table, and let's take some viewer questions. That was a lot of information, but don't crash just yet. We've got about 12 minutes of some interesting viewer questions. I know that you wanted to clarify something that you said earlier.
Right. At the earlier Q&A we had much earlier this morning, I mentioned about the network drivers and what was supported in the box, and I was talking about the Windows NT mini port drivers. As a matter of fact, I just checked into it, and in fact, Windows 95 does ship quite a few of the Windows NT mini port drivers right in the box. Mm-hmm. So I was mistaken. I thought it was only coming from the Windows NT box, but in fact we ship some in the Windows 95 box. Mm-hmm. So
and one other question for you, and Mike in Tallahassee had called this in. Windows 95 supports DHCP, WINS, and DNS. Mm. Can it act as a server for these as well?
Okay, Windows 95 is not going to be configured as a DHCP server. It's not going to allocate and lease out IP addresses. It will receive IP addresses from a Windows NT DHCP server. So if you're going to have a DHCP server or a WINS server, it's going to be on a Windows NT machine and not a Windows 95 machine.
And when you sleep at night, do you see all these initials floating
sometimes I do.
in your head? Talking about sleeping at night, Frank, let me ask you the question that's I'm sure on the mind that everyone is. Okay, state of the product. When's it going to ship?
Well, I think wow, this is a question we get a lot, obviously. Our commitment is to ship this product when it's ready, and we've always said that, and that's something that I'm going to stick by. But we're very confident right now that we're going to meet our August date, and you're going to be able to go out to the store right now and buy it in August. So the product's doing fine. We're right on track. Mm-hmm. We're right where we should be, and I think you can all look forward to getting it in August.
And Preview program is rolling out now, and
yeah, Preview Pro is rolling out now, and worldwide we have hundreds of thousands of users who are using our product right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not the final product; it's a beta version, granted, but we're getting responses every day from them, very positive responses, and we're happy where we are.
Is it cool? Is it exhausting? Is it tiring?
It's kind of both, I mean, my experience here at Microsoft, a lot of people probably wonder about that also, is such that, it's really cool. It's a great product. It's exciting to be around. When I went from WFW to Windows 95, I had a little trepidation like everybody else, but it was just a great experience, and I'm really glad I'm here.
Okay, and this is a test for you, okay?
Yeah.
That browser button, it's history now? From a work group for Windows? Yes. Answer is yes. TC. Don't forget, still time to enter the contest. Autumn, Casey is calling from San Angelo, Texas, on Microsoft Network. I just installed Windows 95 and other Windows for work groups, and other Windows 95 machines cannot see my machine on the network.
Huh, so this came in through MSN. Okay.
Straight in through MSN.
Cool. What was the person's name? Casey?
Casey.
Okay, Casey. So you just installed Windows 95, and you're not able to have other Windows for Workgroups and other Windows 95 machines see your Windows 95 machine on the net. So what we're saying is your Windows 95 machine is probably not acting as a server. One thing to keep in mind is, by default, if you install Windows 95 to a clean directory, we will not install the server services by default. So you'll have to manually add the server. The other thing to keep in mind is if the server is already installed, the IPX protocol is sensitive to frame type, okay? And in Windows for Workgroups, those Windows for Workgroups machines are probably using the default frame type of 802.3. In Windows 95, the default frame type now is 802.2. we use this auto feature, which I talked about earlier. But it's something to keep in mind is if it's fresh on the network, no other machines are speaking to it, we're not going to auto-detect any frame types, so we will default to 802.2. So two things to keep in mind is the server's not installed by default, so make sure you get that installed. And if it is installed, check your IPX frame type and make sure that you're matching the same frame types. 802.2 is a default in Windows 95, 802.3 was a default in Windows Workgroups.
And I think the density and clarity of a lot of this information points out the need for support professionals to really get up and ready on the product. And I'd encourage you to take a look at the kind of courses that are offered at the authorized training channel and the like, because the end users are going to deserve to have an IS professional world that's ready and has the kind of knowledge on the tip of the tongue as you do, Autumn. We had a call back from somebody. Jerry in San Rafael called back and wanted to know, could he use third-party TCP IP utilities with Windows 95?
Sure, Jerry, you can use third-party TCP IP utilities Windows 95, provided that they're conforming to the WinSocket specification.
Okay.
Because typically third-party utilities conform to WinSockets, and WinSockets is part of Windows 95. So provided that we're all talking the same language, WinSockets, then it should work just fine.
And then can truck on through to any other any other site that's on the network. That's great. Frank, we had a question, and Sal in Detroit. Direct. Why isn't Microsoft supporting Windows 95 on MSN?
Well, I mean, I think you have to realize that right now we're in a beta stage of our product still, and MSN is also in a beta state. And to ensure, the fact that the end user would have a very good experience in terms of product support, we've essentially referred them to CompuServe. I want to emphasize the fact that we do provide full phone support for all the beta testers. So this is something that we feel is sufficient, and we really are committed to having a quality response, and therefore we're relying on pointing them to CompuServe.
Question not from the viewers, but for me. How much of the content will actually be in the help system? Will a lot of the information be available to me online?
Yeah, I know the help folks have been really focused on trying to remove most of the data from paper manuals and putting it all online, and they've done an awesome job doing this hypertext, context-sensitive help. Between just wizards and then the troubleshooting books. I demoed a little bit of it earlier, and we'll probably show some more of that in our later programs. But yeah, there's most of the stuff that you probably need to know just as to what does this feature do or what does this component do is all online. If you want to get the big picture of how it all is integrated, you probably should refer to the resource kit.
I know one thing that a lot of the corporate sites are really excited about is their ability to create their own content to slip into the Windows 95 help engine. And I think
that's part of the program, I think, is that there's an API for all of that, and I think you can just write your own help.
And we're investigating continuously different methods of providing help files online to people that has some of this more technical information that you're seeing here today, and in a format which will make it readily accessible to you.
Another music question for you. Does Windows 95 support named pipes?
Okay. Okay.
Pipe name.
Okay. Do we support named pipes? Yes. The protected mode redirector, known as vServer VXD, supports client-side named pipes. So if any application vendors are out there needing named pipes, then it's in there. It's in vServer. I mean vReader.
And let me just say, I want to make sure we got all of our viewer questions here. Here's one more. Dan in San Jose wanted to know, does Windows 95 cache network data on either the client side or the server side?
Yeah, we sure do. Windows 95 supports client side and server side caching for both the SMB and the NCP readers and server. So in other words, the Microsoft client will support client-side caching. The protected mode network client will support client-side caching, as well as the Microsoft server and protected mode network server both support server-side caching.
And let me just ask you a final question, Autumn. You're a trainer like
Yes.
myself. When you're actually training people on the networking piece, is there an area that they seem to really focus in on? I mean, if I had to pay attention, what's the one area that you think would be really helpful for IS professionals to focus on?
That's a tough question. I mean, there's so many components, and really just depends on the environment of what protocols you're using. I think it's just important to understand how to isolate, when you're troubleshooting, isolate which component in the architecture may not be configured properly. So again, if you understand the 3 layers of every network operating system, your redirector, your protocols, and your netcard drivers, if you're able to isolate, then that'll help you focus in on what you need to fix.
And I would assume, Frank, that planning for migration to a network is going to be really important. This isn't something you do on the fly.
No,
you want to
not.
really sit down and do that planning.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, part of the purpose of this program, the program we had preceding this, is to address those issues. And we do make some of that information, like the migration kit, available online to people. So, I mean, you should really take advantage of those resources. There's something that's there for you, and I think if you take advantage of them, you'll be much better off.
Yeah. Well, on behalf of the viewers and the Windows 95 user and technical population, I want to really thank both of you. You've done a great job today, and a lot of information, and you've been honest in your answers. That's all the time that we have today. Our Traincast question and answer line is now closing. Thank you, Autumn, for such an in-depth look at networking Windows 95, and thank you, Frank, for your insightful answers to our viewer questions. You're actually supposed to say you're welcome here. So
You're welcome.
okay, every now we stripped a little bit. It said you're welcome there. Okay, I want to give everyone one more chance to enter the contest, and here's the question. Name one of the network protocols supported by Windows 95. That's it. You have only to name one, and here's the number to call, 1-800-254-4069. I've personally been using Windows 95 for a while now, and the learning curve has been rapid as I've explored and used the new features and technologies embodied in Windows 95. You are now embarked on a similar learning process. Remember, Windows 95 will be the largest technology change in the history of computing. You, as an IS professional, are the key to making the shift to Windows 95 a success. Your early knowledge of this product provides your organization with a valuable asset. The scope of Windows 95, from its networking capabilities to its new user interface to its support of mobile and remote computing, are major developments. Your knowledge, skill, and comfort with Windows 95 are important to your employer, your end users, and to Microsoft. I want to thank you for your questions and your learning interest and your input. We love to hear your feedback about the Traincast series. Please send your comments to mstv@microsoft.com. You can also call 1-800-597-3200 for information. I personally would be real interested in your feedback, and you can reach me at 1-800-95-MAISY. Our next show will continue our in-depth look at networking, specifically with NetWare. Here is our presenter for our next show, Joseph Davies, to give us a sneak preview. Joe?
Hello, my name is Joe Davies. I'm a Windows 95 training specialist and certified NetWare engineer. In the next segment of Windows 95 Traincast, I will be introducing you to the various ways that Windows 95 has integrated support for the Novell NetWare network operating system. It is very important to Microsoft that Novell NetWare customers have high performance, seamless integration, backward compatibility, and a smooth upgrade path to roll out Windows 95. To demonstrate the commitment to high performance and seamless integration, here is a Windows 95 computer that has been configured to support NetWare networks using all Microsoft Protected Mode components. We boot the machine and log in. It runs our login script in Protected Mode, and we can access all of our NetWare resources through the Windows 95 user interface. Since all the components of the network are 32-bit Protected Mode components, they're running as fast as is possible in the Windows 95 operating system without the need for buffering or processor mode switching. To demonstrate Microsoft's commitment to backward compatibility, here is a Windows 95 computer that is using Novell's DOS requester, VLM.exe. We boot the machine and log in before running Windows 95. Once in Windows 95, we can use the same Windows 95 user interface to access NetWare resources. Or we can run Novell's NW user utility to gain access to NetWare servers and directory trees. We can even run the NetWare administrator for NetWare 4. How is all this magic possible? To find out, please tune in for the next Windows 95 Traincast. See you then.
Thank you, Joe. Unfortunately, I will not be here in the studios for your show. I just happened to be getting married that week. But believe me, I will be watching. Perhaps I'll even check in from my tropical honeymoon paradise. Thanks again for joining us. We're happy to be your source for up-to-the-minute information about Windows 95. If you missed it at our mid-break, get your pen and paper handy as we're about to give you addresses and phone numbers for the multitude of resources available to you about Microsoft Windows 95. Good day from Microsoft Studios in Redmond, Washington.
If you'd like to subscribe to Microsoft's WinNews electronic newsletter, send internet email to enews@microsoft.nwnet.com with the words "Subscribe WinNews" as the only text in the body of your message. WinNews file sections can also be found on most major online services and networks. There are a number of electronic distribution points that contain information directly from Microsoft about Windows 95. Use the following electronic addresses for new white papers, press releases, and other documentation. The transcript, content outline, and PowerPoint slides of this broadcast will be available on CompuServe and the World Wide Web at these addresses. To receive the Microsoft Project Template for deployment of Windows 95, send your name, company name, address, phone, and fax numbers via the internet to deploy95@microsoft.com. The Microsoft Project Template is also available on CompuServe, Go, MSTV Forum, Windows 95 Library. The title is Win95p.zip. To receive a beta version of the Windows 95 Resource Kit, or for information, call 1-800-MS-PRESS. Inside Windows 95 by Adrian King is available for $24.95 at most major bookstores, or by calling 1-800-MS-PRESS. To get a program guide for Microsoft TV with information on business-to-business television programs from Microsoft, email us at mstv@microsoft.com or call 1-800-597-3200. To order a videotape of today's program or any others in the Windows 95 Traincast series, call 1-800-597-3200. To receive ongoing information, resources, and tips on training and support strategies for Windows 95, contact this address via email. For information regarding the Managing Windows 95 Learning Kit, or to contact Elliot directly, call 1-800-95-MAISY or send email to this address.